You want to know what the building smelled like when I pushed that door open? Ethan Cole's voice dropped to a whisper that could cut through steel. It smelled like someone had been waiting, and I'd kept them waiting too damn long. A broke ex-Hell's Angel, a rusted door, and a $19 building that wasn't supposed to mean anything. But the moment Ethan stepped inside, he understood something that would take him months to prove. The building hadn't been abandoned. It had been held. If this story already has your heart moving, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The auction started at 9 in the morning, and by 9:15, every person standing in that parking lot had already decided it was a waste of their time. The building sat at the far end of Pueblo's old Thatcher Avenue, like something the city had forgotten to tear down. 2 stories, brick face gone gray with age. The Harley Davidson sign above the entrance had lost half its letters, so what remained read, Har-I Davson, and even that looked embarrassed to still be there. The windows were boarded from the inside. The front lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing straight up through the middle like the earth itself was trying to reclaim the place. The auctioneer, a thin man named Gerald Pritt, who worked county surplus sales on weekends and sold insurance during the week, had printed exactly 43 copies of the property sheet. He'd handed out 9. The rest were still tucked under his arm. Commercial property, he announced to the small crowd, reading from the sheet with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list. Former retail and service facility, approximately 6,000 square feet. Known title deficiencies pending resolution. Property sold as is. Starting bid is set by the county at $19. Someone in the back actually laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that starts in the belly and gets away from a person before they can stop it. Gerald Pritt looked up from his sheet, looked back down, kept reading. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the small crowd with his hands in the pockets of his riding jacket. He hadn't meant to be there. He'd been walking back from the hardware store 2 blocks down, killing time before his afternoon shift at the tire shop on Union, when he'd seen the Orange County auction signs taped to the poles along the block and followed them out of habit more than interest. He wasn't looking for property. He wasn't looking for anything. A man who has nothing doesn't usually go looking for more of the same. He was 44 years old. He had $137 in a checking account that charged him $8 a month to exist. He had a 2003 Sportster that ran when it felt like running, parked outside the apartment he shared with a rotating cast of near strangers because the rent was $400 and the other option was the street. He had a mechanic's certification he hadn't used at a legitimate shop in 6 years, a discipline citation from his former chapter that had effectively ended his membership, and the particular kind of posture that develops in men who have been walking through the world apologizing for taking up space. He had been a Hell's Angel for 11 years. He had been former for 3. The exit hadn't been dramatic. No ceremony, no confrontation. He'd made a call he wasn't supposed to make, gotten a brother into trouble trying to get him out of worse trouble, and the math hadn't worked the way he'd calculated. Nobody put hands on him. Nobody had to. There was a meeting. There was a decision. And then he was on the outside of something he'd built his entire adult identity around, standing in a parking lot in Albuquerque with a tank bag and nowhere specific to point the bike. He drifted north eventually, Pueblo, because he knew someone who knew someone. The someone he knew turned out to be unreliable. The someone they knew turned out to have moved to Denver, and Pueblo turned out to be Pueblo, a working city that didn't ask many questions and didn't offer many answers, which suited Ethan's particular condition just fine. He was not a man in crisis. He was past crisis. Crisis requires a person to believe that the current moment is exceptional, that things could be different, that something could change. Ethan had moved beyond that into a territory with no particular name, where you wake up, do the necessary things, lie back down, and wait for the days to accumulate into something that eventually makes sense. He wasn't waiting for sense anymore either. He was just waiting. So when Gerald Pritt read out the $19 opening bid, and the crowd made the sounds crowds make when they hear a joke, Ethan didn't laugh. He looked at the building. He looked at it the way a mechanic looks at an engine someone else has given up on. Not with hope, with habit. Do I have any opening bids at $19? Gerald Pritt said it without much expectation. He'd done county auctions long enough to know that title-deficient properties with known encumbrances went in one of 2 directions, Either a developer with lawyers bought them for dirt and then took a year to untangle the paperwork, or they sat unsold and went back into the county portfolio for another cycle. Neither outcome required any particular excitement from the auctioneer. Ethan raised his hand, not dramatically, not with any particular feeling. He raised it the way a man raises his hand in a meeting he didn't know he'd signed up for. Gerald Pritt looked at him a second time. $19. Do I have 20? Oh, I ain't. Nobody moved. The man who'd laughed heavy-set, maybe 60, wearing a Carhartt jacket and the general expression of someone whose morning was not going the way he'd planned, turned around and actually looked at Ethan. Not with hostility, with something closer to genuine puzzlement. Son, he said not unkindly, you know there's a title dispute on that property, right? You could win the auction and never own the thing. I know, Ethan said. $19 going once, Gerald Pritt said with a note of professional uncertainty that suggested this outcome was unusual even by county auction standards. What are you going to do with it? The heavy-set man asked. Don't know yet. Going twice. You're not a developer. No. Sold, Gerald Pritt said to the gentleman in the back. There was a brief silence. Then three people spoke at the same time, none of them to Ethan directly. All of them in the tone people use when they've witnessed something they can't immediately categorize. Ethan walked up to Gerald Pritt's folding table and wrote a check for $19. Gerald Pritt looked at the check, then at Ethan, then at the building, then back at the check. You understand the property transfers with all existing encumbrances? Gerald Pritt said. He was legally obligated to say it. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to editorialize about other people's decisions. I do. There's a potential challenge to the auction validity. You may receive notice of legal proceedings. All right, Gerald Pritt folded the check. I'll have the paperwork processed by end of week. You'll receive a conditional certificate of ownership pending resolution of the title matters. How long does that usually take? Could be months, could be longer. Ethan nodded. He picked up the single key on the county ring, an old schloggy key worn at the grip attached to a plastic tag that read Unit 4471 Thatcher Avenue in faded marker, and put it in his jacket pocket. He walked back toward the building. Behind him, he heard a heavy-set man say to no one in particular, I don't know whether to feel sorry for him or buy him a beer. The key didn't want to turn. That was the first thing. The lock hadn't been touched in however many years since the place had been sealed, and the cylinder had corroded enough that the key went in fine but met resistance when he tried to rotate it. Ethan stood there on the front step, not forcing it, feeling the resistance, and adjusting his grip, finding the angle. He'd spent enough years with his hands inside engines to understand that forcing something that resisted usually broke the thing you needed most. He worked the key slowly. A quarter turn, back, a quarter turn, again. He felt something give slightly, then lock up, then give a little more. He put his left hand flat against the doorframe and let the resistance in his right hand talk to him. 3 minutes, maybe 4. The lock turned, the door swung inward. The smell came first. Not rot, not mold though, there was some of that underneath. It was the smell of a sealed space oil and metal, and old leather, and something else that Ethan couldn't name immediately, but which lodged itself in the back of his memory and began quietly to pull at something. It was the smell of a working shop, the mineral smell of gear oil, the particular bite of old tool metal, and underneath all of it, very faint, almost imagined the ghost of coffee. Ethan stood in the doorway. He did not go in immediately. He stood there and let his eyes adjust and let his other senses do their work first, the way he'd been trained to stand outside a situation before entering it. His whole life he'd moved too fast into things. He'd learned that lesson late and at considerable cost. What he saw slowly resolving out of the dimness stopped him in a way he hadn't expected. The bikes were still there. 3 of them, 2 on the floor, 1 on a center stand, all Harleys, all old enough to be interesting, recent enough to be familiar. Dust covered them in the uniform gray layer that time puts on everything it holds on to. But they were intact, no vandalism, no stripping, no evidence that anyone had been inside the building at all since the day the doors were locked. The service counter ran along the left wall, glass-top display cases underneath empty. Now the felt pads still in place where merchandise had once rested. Behind the counter, the pegboard still had tools hanging on it. Not all of them, but enough. Wrenches, sockets, 2 good snap-on ratchets. A torque wrench that even from a distance looked like it had been hung with care. And on the counter itself, a coffee cup, just sitting there, like someone had set it down to answer a question and never came back to pick it up again. Ethan walked in. His boots on the concrete floor made a sound that the building amplified into something almost ceremonial. He moved to the counter, looked at the coffee cup. Ceramic, white with a black handle. Some residue of whatever had been in it dried to nothing years ago. A faint ring on the glass counter around the base. On the wall above the service counter, a calendar. The paper was yellowed and curled at the corners. The month it showed was October. He had to look closely at the year. He looked at it twice. 12 years ago. This building had been sealed for 12 years. He walked behind the counter, moved carefully through the tools, checked the back workspace. The service bay was dark. He found the breaker box on the back wall and opened it, not expecting anything, and was genuinely surprised when the power was still live. He tripped the main breaker and lights came on. Fluorescent, one flickering, two out entirely, but four of them working, throwing the bay into the particular flat brightness of a working shop. The lift was still in the down position. The hydraulic jack was still in the corner. The diagnostic equipment was old but present. The oil drain pans were stacked on the shelf where they belonged. Whoever had locked this place up had not done it in a hurry. They'd done it with the specific care of someone who intended for a shop to still be a shop when the doors opened again. Ethan stood in the middle of the service bay and turned a slow circle. He was not a sentimental man. He'd trained that out of himself early, or maybe it had been trained out of him by circumstance, or maybe he'd just lived long enough in conditions that don't reward sentiment to have filed the impulse somewhere he couldn't easily access. But standing in the middle of this bay, with the smell of old oil and the light of old fluorescence and the three covered bikes waiting on the floor, like they'd just been parked for a long weekend. Something happened in his chest that he couldn't name and wasn't going to try. He walked back out to the front, stood behind the service counter, and put both hands flat on the glass. That's when he saw it. Not immediately. It was the kind of thing you see because you're standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, the light hitting at an angle that reveals an edge you wouldn't otherwise notice. Under the counter, not in the display cases, behind them, against the wall. A steel box, military green, combination lock, small enough to carry with two hands, heavy enough from the look of it to matter. He crouched down, reached in, put his hands around it. Heavy. Whatever was inside there was enough of it. He set it on the counter. He tried the combination lock out of habit, running it through a few common sequences, knowing it wouldn't work, not particularly surprised when it didn't. He examined the box itself, the gauge of the steel, the quality of the hinges, the lock mechanism. Government surplus or close to it. Someone had not put cheap things inside a cheap container. He stood back. He was aware suddenly that he had bought this building 40 minutes ago. He had bought it because he raised his hand. He had raised his hand because he was walking past and the price was $19 and something in him, some mechanism that had nothing to do with reason, had moved his arm before his brain could run the calculation. He had $19 left in his checking account. Not counting the $8 monthly fee, he couldn't remember if he'd paid. He was standing in a building he technically might not own in a town he'd arrived in by accident, looking at a locked steel box that someone had left under a counter they'd covered in a cup of coffee they'd never come back to drink. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. The tire shop. He was supposed to be there in 20 minutes. He set the box back under the counter exactly where he'd found it. He took a photograph of the service bay. He took a photograph of the calendar. He took a photograph of the coffee cup. He locked the front door behind him, worked the cylinder back through its resistance until he heard the bolt engage and stood on the front step for a moment, looking out at Old Thatcher Avenue. He pulled out his phone and called the tire shop. "Bobby, it's Ethan." He waited. "I'm not going to make it in today." He listened. I know, I'll make it right." He hung up. He stood there another moment. Then he turned back to the building. The first thing he needed was light. Not just the fluorescence in the back bay full light daylight, or as close to it as he could get so he could see the front space properly. The boards on the windows were screwed in from inside, which meant he could remove them, which meant he needed a drill or a screwdriver. He had neither at the building. He walked to the hardware store. He bought a cordless screwdriver, a set of bits, a dust mask, a pair of work gloves, and a drop cloth using $41 of the cash he had in his wallet from his last paycheck. He did the math without thinking about it the way people who live close to the line always do the math, automatic and precise. He had $62 in his wallet, 61 after the transaction, and the checking account that started the day at 137 was now 118. He walked back. He went inside. He started pulling boards. The first board came off the north-facing front window, and the daylight came in at the angle of 2 in the afternoon. And what it illuminated stopped him again, but this time for a different reason. The front room was bigger than it had looked in the fluorescent light of the bay. The display floor held more than just the 3 bikes he'd noticed. There was a fourth one partially behind a half-wall divider, and it was different from the others. Older, a knucklehead if he was seeing it right, and he was. The model ran from the late 30s through the early 50s, and this one he crossed the floor and crouched next to it. He wasn't an antique specialist. His training was in late model service and repair, the mechanical work of the past 25 years. But he'd been around bikes long enough and around people who loved bikes long enough to know what he was looking at. This machine had been maintained. Recently was the wrong word. Nothing in this building was recent, but maintained in the sense that someone had taken care of it with the consistency that prevents serious deterioration. The chrome had oxidized but hadn't pitted. The leather was cracked but hadn't decayed. The engine case was dirty with age, but when he put his hand flat against it and then looked at his palm, the grime was surface, not deep. "What did you do for a living?" he said out loud to no one. The building didn't answer, but it held the question. He went back to pulling boards. By 4 o'clock, all 4 front windows were uncovered. The daylight transformed the space in a way that the fluorescence hadn't, picking up the colors that the dust muted but couldn't entirely suppress. The old Harley orange in the signage above the parts counter, the deep walnut of the counter itself, the pale green of a vintage tool chest in the corner that someone had painted over with green enamel and then never repainted when the fashion changed. He stood in the middle of the floor and turned in a slow circle. The building was not a ruin. A ruin has surrendered. This building had simply been waiting, which is a different state entirely. It had been maintained to a minimum threshold, and this sealed with care, and left to the kind of time that preserves rather than destroys, the way coal preserves things that heat would rot. He pulled out his phone and searched the property records online. The county database was slow and clunky, and he had to navigate through 3 different screens, but the information was there. The building had last been registered to a business entity called Hayes Moto LLC. The principal on the filing was listed as Virgil C. Hayes. The business had been formally dissolved 12 years ago. The property had reverted to county control after 3 years of unpaid taxes and had been sitting in the county inventory since. Virgil C. Hayes. He searched the name. Not much came up. A Facebook profile that hadn't been updated in over a decade. An old newspaper listing in the Pueblo Chieftain, a 2-paragraph piece about a local business receiving a community service commendation from the city. The article had a photograph, black and white, small, the resolution poor, of a man shaking hands with someone who appeared to be a city official. Ethan enlarged the photograph as much as the resolution would allow. The man was older, probably mid-60s when the photo was taken, heavy in the shoulders, white hair cut close. The expression on his face was not the expression most people put on for photographs. He wasn't smiling, wasn't performing ease. He looked directly at whoever had taken the picture with the composed, specific attention of someone who was used to watching things and thinking about what he saw. Ethan set the phone down on the counter. He looked at the steel box. The steel box, he realized, was not going to open without the combination, which meant he either found the combination or cut it, and cutting it felt like the wrong first move. The combination felt like something that should exist somewhere in this building. The kind of person who leaves a shop locked and waiting doesn't leave the means to open the important things inaccessible. That would defeat the purpose. He looked at the service counter. He went through it carefully. Every drawer, every compartment, every space where a piece of paper or a key or a note might have been left. He found parts catalogs, mostly outdated, a pricing book from 12 years ago, some pens, a ruler, a customer receipt book, the carbon copies still in place, the entries made in the careful block capitals of someone who understood that paperwork would outlast memory. He read through the receipt book. Each entry was a service record, make, model, year, work performed, cost. The entries were detailed and consistent. He read through several dozen of them. The work was the kind of work he recognized from his own training, the systematic care of machines by someone who understood that a motorcycle treated well would repay that treatment in ways that couldn't be precisely measured, but were always eventually felt. At the back of the receipt book, tucked inside the back cover so that it was invisible, unless you opened the cover fully and tilted the book toward the light, there was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. 4 numbers, written in the same block capitals as the receipt entries. Nothing else on the paper, no label, no explanation. He went back to the steel box. He tried the numbers. The lock opened. He stood there with the lid of the box in his hands. And what he saw inside made him set the lid down very carefully, step back from the counter, and stand there in the middle of the front floor for almost a full minute without moving. There were 3 things in the box. The first was a set of ledgers, 5 of them small enough to stack flat in the box with room to spare. Composition notebooks, the kind you buy in a school supply aisle, with black and white marbled covers. Each one was labeled on the cover in permanent marker. Not dates, names. The second was a cassette tape, the kind that went into a standard player 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches, with a white label on each face. On the A side, written in the same block capitals he was beginning to recognize for whoever comes next. On the B side, play after you read. He didn't have a cassette player. The third was an envelope. A standard letter envelope, white sealed. His name was written on the front of it. Not to the new owner, not to whom it may concern. His name, Ethan. 1 word, his first name, written in the block capital hand of a man he had never met in a sealed building in a locked box under a counter he'd found by accident in a building he'd bought 40 minutes after learning it existed. He picked up the envelope. He set it back down. He picked it up again. He turned it over. The seal on the back was intact. Whoever had written his name on the front had not left it open. They had sealed it, which meant they had intended for it to be found and opened in some particular order under some particular circumstances by some particular person. He stood there. He thought about a lot of things very fast, the way a person's mind can process impossible information rapidly when the alternative is to stop functioning entirely. He thought about the $19. He thought about the raised hand. He thought about the key and the lock and the 4 numbers and the receipt book and the coffee cup. He thought about a man named Virgil C. Hayes who had taken a community service commendation photograph with the particular expression of someone who was already somewhere else in their mind. "What is this?" he said out loud, the question addressed to the building in general. The building didn't answer. He put the envelope in his inside jacket pocket. He stacked the ledgers beside the box. He left the cassette tape where it was without a player. It was just an object. He thought about where to find a cassette player in the 21st century, which led to thoughts about thrift stores and pawn shops, and whether any of the people he knew in Pueblo had held on to one. He locked the front door. He stood outside in the late afternoon, the sun dropping toward the mountains in the west, the air carrying the particular fall cold of Pueblo, that he'd learned to expect a dry cold that came down from the high country and didn't apologize for itself. He had not eaten since that morning. He had not drunk anything since a cup of bad coffee at the tire shop before he'd been told politely but clearly that he was essentially done there. He walked home. He sat in his room, a 9x12 space with a window that faced the alley, his sleeping bag on the floor because the mattress situation had resolved itself in someone else's favor during the last rotation, the sum total of what he owned arranged with the particular neatness of someone who has learned that disorder in small spaces makes small spaces unbearable. He took the envelope out of his jacket. He sat with it in his hands for a long time. He thought about the word on the front, his name. 1 word, his first name only, which was either a familiarity or a specificity, and neither option was comfortable. A familiarity implied someone who knew him. A specificity implied someone who had chosen him. He was not accustomed to being chosen for things. The last time he'd been chosen for something, the choosing had ended in a way that had led him here. He put the envelope on the floor in front of him and looked at it. He was going to have to eat something. He was going to have to sleep. He was going to have to think about what came next in the careful, limited way that a man with $118 and no job thinks about what comes next, which is to say 1 day at a time, 1 thing at a time, no grand calculations allowed because grand calculations require resources he did not have. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. He unfolded it. It was not a long letter. Virgil C. Hayes, whoever he had not been a man who used words to fill silence. What he'd written filled barely half the page, and the handwriting in the same block capitals, deliberate and precise, was the hand of someone who had thought carefully about every word before committing it. Ethan, I've been watching for the right person for a long time. Longer than you'd think. I almost gave up on the idea that the right person would come. You won't remember me, but I remember you. There was a cold morning about 9 years ago outside Walsenburg, a breakdown on the 25. I was traveling solo, which was my own foolishness, and the bike left me in a way that I couldn't fix without parts I didn't have. You stopped. You didn't ask who I rode with. You didn't ask anything. You diagnosed the problem in about 5 minutes, fabricated a temporary fix from what you had in your own bags, and got me back on the road. I offered to pay you, and you said, and I wrote this down because I knew I'd want to remember it. You said, this isn't that kind of thing. I didn't know your name that morning. I found it later. I watched from a distance for a long time after. I'm not going to tell you that I arranged for you to be here, because the truth is, I couldn't arrange anything that specific. But I believe strongly enough to act on the belief that if I made the conditions right, if the building was there, if the price was right, if the moment was available, the right person would find it. You found it. The ledgers will tell you what I did here. The tape will tell you why. Read the ledgers first. The building is yours now. What you do with that is your own business. But if you're inclined to use it the way I used it, there are people in this city who will understand what you're continuing. They'll find you. Give it time. This isn't a gift. It's a responsibility. Don't panic. Just work. VH. Ethan read the letter twice. He set it down on the floor in front of him. He sat there in his room with the sleeping bag and the alley window and the $118 and the letter from a dead man who had been watching him for 9 years. He thought about Walsenburg. He thought about the morning on the 25th. He remembered the breakdown. He'd stopped for dozens of breakdowns over the years. It was a thing you did. It was the code you stopped and you helped and you moved on. But he had a specific memory of that particular morning that surfaced now with a clarity he hadn't expected. An older man, traveling alone. A big bore touring bike with a fuel delivery issue he'd been able to trace quickly because the symptoms were familiar. He'd made the fix with a piece of hose from his own kit and a clamp he'd been carrying as backup. 15 minutes, maybe 20. The man had offered money, and he'd said what he always said when someone offered to pay him for something that felt like a human obligation rather than a transaction. This isn't that kind of thing. He hadn't thought about it again after the man rode away. He'd gotten back on his own bike and continued south, and the morning had filed itself away in the category of things that happened and then receded, which is where most mornings go. Apparently that morning had gone somewhere else entirely. He picked up the first ledger. He opened it, and the world he thought he understood began quietly and then all at once to shift beneath him. The first ledger had a name on the cover that Ethan didn't recognize. Marcus T. Bellows. He opened it. The first entry was dated 11 years ago, written in Virgil's block capitals, precise and unhurried. It read like a case file, except that no case file Ethan had ever seen opened the way this one did. Marcus came in February. His wife had left in January. His truck was repossessed in early February. He had 2 kids in the Centennial School District and no way to get them there. He told me he didn't need charity. He needed someone to believe he was still worth betting on. I told him I wasn't in the charity business. I put him to work in the Bay at $12 an hour, which was under what I should have paid him and more than he was making. He fixed bikes faster than anyone I'd had in 3 years. Within 6 weeks, I raised him to 16. He didn't know where the extra money came from. He thought it was merit. It was partly merit. It was also partly that I had been watching his situation and I believed the calculation was sound. Ethan turned the page. The entries continued. Month by month, Virgil tracked Marcus Bellows the way a careful investor tracks a position he believes in, not with sentiment, but with the disciplined attention of someone who has committed resources and intends to see the outcome through. The entries noted when Marcus's attendance stabilized, when his work quality improved, and when he paid off the first of 2 debts. Virgil had quietly settled on his behalf through what the ledger described only as third-party arrangement. There was no self-congratulation in the writing. There was no record of Marcus's gratitude, no scene of revelation or thanks. The closest thing to emotion in the entire ledger was a single line near the end of the fourth month. He doesn't know. He shouldn't. The work is the point, not the knowing. Ethan set the ledger down. He picked it up again. He read it again from the beginning, slowly this time, because the first read had moved too fast for the information to fully land. The second read was different. The second read showed him something the first one had missed: the systematic nature of what Virgil had done. It wasn't random generosity. It wasn't impulse. It was engineered. Virgil had identified a specific problem in a specific person's life, calculated the most efficient intervention, executed it through channels that kept his involvement invisible, and then tracked the outcome with the same diligence a doctor tracks a patient recovering from surgery. He opened the second ledger. A woman named Sandra Oakes, single mother, had come in to get an estimate on a repair she couldn't afford and had mentioned in passing that she was 2 months behind on rent. The ledger entry was careful. She didn't ask for help. People who don't ask are often the ones who need it most and will use it best. I made an arrangement with her landlord. She never knew. She caught up on her own within 3 months, which told me the problem was temporary and the person was sound. Third ledger. A man named Pete Dillard, a mechanic who'd been let go from a competitor's shop on a pretextual reason that Virgil described in the closest thing to outrage the ledgers ever showed, as a coward's way to avoid paying a man what he'd earned. Virgil had hired Pete, taught him the particular way Hayes Moto did things. And then the entry was matter of fact about this: spent 14 months quietly working through a contact to get Pete's former employer cited for wage theft. The citation resulted in a settlement. Virgil's role in initiating the complaint was nowhere in the record. The ledger entry simply noted the outcome: Pete received $4,200 in back wages. He bought his daughter a bike for Christmas. This is what money is for. Ethan closed the third ledger. He sat there on the sleeping bag in his room, with the ledgers stacked in front of him and the letter from Virgil on the floor and the envelope on top of that, and he thought about the word Virgil had used. Responsibility, not gift, not inheritance, not opportunity, responsibility. He had been given a building and a set of ledgers and a letter that told him he had been chosen based on a 15-minute repair on a highway 9 years ago. He had been left a system that a dead man had built over what appeared to be decades, a system of intervention so carefully designed to be invisible that the people inside it never knew they were inside it. And the question that arrived in his chest, not gently, was, why? Not why him. That was answered after a fashion by the letter. The question was bigger than that. Why had Virgil Hayes built this thing and then left it to be found by a stranger? Why not leave it to someone he knew? Someone inside, whatever network had grown up around these ledgers. Why make it contingent on the right person showing up at the right auction and raising the right hand at the right moment for $19? He lay back on the sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling. He was not going to sleep. He knew that before he closed his eyes. His mind was moving too fast in the particular way it moved when he'd been given a problem he couldn't yet see the edges of, the way an engine problem sometimes reveals itself as not one problem, but 3 nested inside each other. And the solution to the first one doesn't work until you've found the second, and the solution to the second doesn't work until you've found the third. He lay there until the light through the alley window went from dark to gray, and then he got up. He was back at the building before 7. The lock turned faster this time. He'd found the angle. He pushed the door open and stood in the entry and breathed the smell of the place and felt again the thing he couldn't name. It was not comfort exactly. It was closer to recognition. The feeling of walking into a room where something has been happening for a long time and will continue to happen with or without you, and what you feel is not possession, but proximity. He had work to do. He understood that clearly enough. The building was not going to rehabilitate itself, and whatever responsibility Virgil had left him could not be exercised from a sleeping bag in a 9x12 room. He needed to be here, which meant he needed the building to be functional, which meant he needed to start working. He started with the service bay, not because it was the most urgent thing, because it was the thing he knew. When a man has been stripped of most of the things that constituted his identity, the things that remain are the things that were there before. The identity was constructed, the skills, the habits, the particular way. Hands know how to do certain things without being told. Ethan Cole's hands knew how to work on motorcycles. That had been true before the club, through the club, and it would be true now after. He pulled the first bike out from under its dust cover, a 2008 Softail Deluxe. Under the dust, it was in better condition than it had any right to be after 12 years in a sealed building. The tires were flat expected, the battery was dead expected. The fuel in the tank had gone to varnish, expected and addressable. The chrome had surface oxidation, but no deep pitting. The engine case was intact. The primary chain cover showed no leaks, which meant the gaskets had held, which was either luck or very good original work. He put his hand on the tank. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what you need." He worked. He didn't plan it or organize it in his mind. First, he just started the way he always started, with what was in front of him and what it told him. The tools on the pegboard were good tools, most of them better than anything he'd personally owned in the past 3 years. He found the shop's compressed air line still attached to the compressor in the back, and when he plugged in the compressor and turned it on, and it ran, which was not something he had expected, and which added itself to the growing list of things about this building that defied the normal logic of abandonment. The Softail needed tires. It needed a battery. It needed the fuel system flushed and cleaned and rebuilt with fresh product. It needed brake fluid and coolant checks and a full safety inspection. None of that was complicated. All of it was work he could do with what was in this shop. He was 3 hours into it when he heard the knock on the front door. He went out to the front. A woman stood outside the glass, shading her eyes to see through it. She was somewhere in her 60s, slight gray hair cut practically short, wearing a down vest and carrying a canvas bag. She didn't look alarmed or suspicious. She looked patient, like someone who had been expecting to knock on this door for some time and was not particularly surprised that she'd arrived at the moment she had. He unlocked the door and opened it. "You're the one who bought it," she said, not a question. "I'm Ethan Cole. I know who you are." She said it without menace, just as fact. "My name is Ruth Calloway. Can I come in?" He stepped back. She entered, looked around the front room with an expression that held something complicated, recognition and grief maybe, or recognition and relief, and those two things not entirely separate. "I knew Virgil," she said. "I figured, he told me someone would come." She turned to look at Ethan directly. "He didn't tell me it would take 12 years. Ethan said nothing. He waited. Ruth Calloway set her canvas bag on the counter and unzipped it. Inside was a cassette player, a small Sony portable, the kind that ran on AA batteries. She set it on the counter. "I've had this in a drawer for 11 years, she said. "Virgil gave it to me when he closed the building. He said when the right person finds the tape, bring them this. He told me I'd know when it happened." She paused. "My grandson saw the county auction listing online. He thought it was funny, a $19 building. He sent me the screenshot." She looked at the counter, then at Ethan. "I called Gerald Pritt. He told me a man named Ethan Cole had purchased the property." She reached into her bag and set 2 AA batteries beside the player. "I've been wondering what was on that tape for 11 years. Ethan went and got the cassette tape from the steel box. He came back to the counter. He put the batteries in the player. He put the tape in the player. He pressed play. The quality was what you'd expect from a cassette recorded in a quiet room a long time ago. A small amount of hiss. Then a voice, a man's voice, low and unhurried, the voice of someone who spoke the way he wrote, with the discipline of a person who had thought carefully about every word before committing it. "If you're hearing this," Virgil Hayes said, "then you found the box, you found the combination, and you made it past the locked front door, which means you're probably the person I've been waiting for, or close enough that the distinction doesn't matter." Ruth Calloway stood very still beside Ethan. She was looking at the cassette player with the focused attention of a person who has waited a long time to hear something and intends to hear every word. "I'm not going to tell you who I was or make you believe I was something special. I ran a motorcycle shop in Pueblo, Colorado for 22 years. I hired people when I could afford to, and sometimes when I couldn't. I fixed bikes for people who couldn't pay me, and I fixed bikes for people who could pay me. And I didn't treat those transactions differently because the bike doesn't know the difference, and neither does the person who needs to get home. But there was another thing I did. It's in the ledgers. I don't know how much of it you've read, but you'll get through it eventually. What I want you to understand is that the system wasn't charity. I want to be clear about that because charity creates something I didn't want to create. Charity creates a recipient. What I built creates a participant. Every person in those ledgers participated in their own recovery. I just adjusted the conditions." Ethan's hands were on the counter. He was looking at the cassette player. "The building knows what it's for." "I know that sounds like something a foolish old man would say. I'm saying it anyway. There are machines in that shop that haven't run in years and they'll run. There are people in this city who owe debts they don't know how to pay, and some of them will find you, and some of them you'll have to find first. That's the work. The ledgers are the map. I want to tell you about the knucklehead. Ruth Calloway made a small sound, not quite a word. The knucklehead was my father's. He bought it new, and he rode it for 30 years, and when he couldn't ride anymore, he serviced it himself until he couldn't do that either. And then he brought it to me. He said, "Virgil, keep this right." He didn't mean just mechanically right. He meant in the way that a thing can be kept right when the person who loved it can't keep it right themselves. He meant understand that the object carries something the object itself can't contain. That's what the building is. Keep it right. Virgil, the tape clicked to silence. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Ruth Calloway cleared her throat. "He was a complicated man," she said. Not in a difficult way, in the way that people are complicated when they've thought about things longer than most people think about things. "How did you know him?" "He helped my son." She said it simply without performance. 20 years ago, my son was in a situation he shouldn't have been in, making decisions he shouldn't have been making. Virgil employed him for 2 years. He didn't just give him work. He gave him, she paused, looking for the word. He gave him structure, and then he held him to it. When my son made mistakes, Virgil didn't excuse them, but he didn't discard him either. He just pointed at the work and said, "Get back to it." She picked up her canvas bag. "My son is a master mechanic in Colorado Springs now, has been for 15 years. He has a shop of his own and 3 employees." Ethan thought about Marcus Bellows and Pete Dillard and Sandra Oaks and the ledgers sitting in his jacket pockets. "Was he in the ledgers?" Ethan asked. "Your son?" "I don't know," she said. "I never saw the ledgers. I only knew the results." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Are you going to stay?" The question was direct enough that it deserved a direct answer. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded. "When you decide, there are things I can tell you about the suppliers Virgil used, about the relationships he built with other businesses on this block, about the particular way he ran the parts side of the operation." She looked at the room one more time, the particular look of someone making a comparison between what they remembered and what they see. "It looks the same," she said quietly. "That's either very good or very strange. I haven't decided which." She left. Ethan stood at the counter. He picked up the 4th ledger, the one he hadn't opened yet. He opened it. The name on the first page stopped him. Not because he recognized it immediately, because of what the first line of the entry said below the name. "I saw this man turn away from his club to do the right thing for a stranger. It cost him everything he'd built. Most people given that choice make the other one. He made this one, and I think he doesn't understand yet what that means about the kind of man he is. I'm going to give him time to figure it out." Ethan's hands had gone still. He read the line again. He turned to the name at the top of the page. Cole Ethan D. He sat down on the floor. Not a decision, his legs made the decision for him. He sat down with the ledger in his hands and his back against the display counter, and he read what Virgil Hayes had written about him over a period of years. It was not a comfortable document. Virgil had been precise and unsentimental, and the unsentimental account of Ethan's life from the outside was different from the version Ethan carried from the inside. Not in the facts, but in the interpretation. Where Ethan saw failure, the chapter, the expulsion, the drift north, the tire shop, the 9x12 room, Virgil had seen something else. He'd seen a sequence, a set of conditions, a man being slowly stripped of the things that had been covering something underneath. November, I checked on Cole again. He's in Pueblo now, working at a tire shop. This is the 4th job in 2 years. He's not unstable. The job's end through no particular fault of his own, mostly. He's in the phase where the cover story has been removed, and he hasn't found the real story yet. This is the dangerous time. A lot of men in this phase make permanent decisions. I don't think Cole will. He's still making temporary ones. That's important. February, he helped a woman change a tire in the parking lot of the Walmart on Fortino. He didn't know her, or she didn't ask him. He just saw it needed to be done and did it. I've been watching for these moments, the acts that have no audience, no benefit, no strategic value. They tell you more about a person's actual character than anything they do when someone's looking. "You were watching me," Ethan said out loud to the empty building. He read on. "March, the auction has been set. I've confirmed with Gerald Pritt's office that the county is moving forward with the surplus listing. The starting price will be nominal. They know the title situation makes it essentially unmarketable. I've made my arrangements. I don't know if Cole will see the signs. I've put them on every pole on the block. If he walks that block, and I believe he walks that block, his pattern suggests the hardware store on Thursdays he'll see them. What he does with what he sees is his own. Ethan's jaw had tightened while he read. Not anger exactly, something more complex, the particular feeling of learning that a moment you experienced as accidental was not accidental, that the raised hand and the $19 and the casual turn off the sidewalk had been anticipated by someone who was no longer alive to be confronted about it. He wanted to be angry. He assembled the components of anger, the surveillance, the manipulation of conditions, the presumption that a dead man had the right to engineer a living man's choices, and he held them up and examined them. And the anger didn't quite come, because the last entry in the ledger, the last thing Virgil Hayes had written about Ethan Cole, was not about arrangements or calculations. It was dated 4 months before the auction, and it was the shortest entry in the book. I don't know if this will work. I'm not certain of much anymore. What I'm certain of is this: the building needs someone who has had things taken away and knows what it can and still chooses to give. I've only met a few people in my life who qualify. Cole qualifies. The rest is up to him. Ethan closed the ledger. He put it on the counter above his head. He sat on the floor for a long time. He thought about what it meant to be chosen by a dead man based on the accumulated evidence of a life that had not by any conventional measure been a success. He thought about the 9 years between Walsenburg and Pueblo and the things that had happened in those 9 years. The years in the chapter, the brother he tried to help the call he shouldn't have made, the meeting in the parking lot in Albuquerque, the drift north. He thought about the fact that Virgil Hayes had been watching all of it. Not every moment he wasn't omniscient, the ledger made that clear, but watching the pattern, the overall shape of a life viewed from outside by someone who had a particular theory about what that shape meant. And then he thought about the ledgers, all 5 of them, Marcus and Sandra and Pete and the others, and now himself, the 5th entry in a system that Virgil had called not charity, but participation. He got up. He went back to the service bay. He picked up the wrench he'd set down when Ruth Calloway knocked. He went back to work on the Softail. By mid-afternoon, he needed parts. Not many, not expensive. A fuel petcock, a set of battery cables, 2 valve stem inserts. The kind of parts any serious shop would have in stock, and which a shop that had been sealed for 12 years would not. He needed to know where to get them, and he needed to know whether he had any credit anywhere in this city, which was a question with a short and unambiguous answer. He didn't. He had $41 in his wallet. He had $118 in the checking account. He had $159 to his name and a conditional certificate of ownership for a building whose title was in dispute. He sat on the service bay bench and did the math the way he always did the math, automatic and honest, and without the softening that people apply to numbers they don't want to face. He needed parts. Parts cost money. He did not have money. He had a building that potentially contained 3 motorcycles that could be worth real money if restored, but restoration required parts and time and tools and energy costs he couldn't yet pay. He needed to generate cash. He thought about the skills inventory. He was a certified mechanic. He had tools, the shop's tools, which were here and which he was using without explicit authorization, but which felt under the terms of Virgil's letter like a reasonable interpretation of the situation. He had a bay, he had a lift, he had an air compressor that worked. He had everything necessary to take in paying work except customers. He went to the front window and looked out at Old Thatcher Avenue. The street had moderate traffic. A few businesses occupied the block: a hardware store, a laundromat, a bar with a sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the building's calendar. At the far end, a gas station. He went to the door and opened it and stood in the entry. He had no sign. He had no internet presence. He had no way for anyone to know that the building that had been dark for 12 years was now tentatively and without much confidence open. He stood there for a few minutes. A man walked past on the sidewalk, maybe 50, riding, jacket, the particular walk of a biker who has left his bike around a corner and is headed somewhere specific. He glanced at Ethan without much interest. "Hey," Ethan said. The man stopped, turned. "Are you riding today?" The man looked at him for a moment. "Yeah. What are you on? A small shift in the man's expression, the universal response of a rider who has been asked the right question by someone who might actually understand the answer. Fat Bob, 2019. How's it running? A longer pause. Fine. Then reluctantly, honestly, there's a rattle in the primary I've been meaning to look at. Bring it around, Ethan said. I'll look at it for free. Tell me if it's something serious and what it'd cost to fix. No charge for the diagnostic. The man looked at the building, looked at Ethan. You're open, working on it. You got the tools in there. Good ones. The man said nothing for a moment. Then give me 10 minutes. His name was Danny Voss. The Fat Bob had a primary chain tensioner that was worn enough to be producing the rattle, but not worn enough to be immediately dangerous. Ethan diagnosed it in 4 minutes, showed Danny exactly what was wrong, told him what the repair involved, and gave him a number. Danny stood there with his hands on the bike and looked at the work order Ethan had written on a piece of paper from the receipt book he'd found in the drawer. That's less than the dealer would charge, Danny said. I know. Why? Ethan thought about the ledgers. Because you came in, he said. That means something. Danny Voss left his Fat Bob and walked to wherever he'd been going. He came back 2 hours later and the primary was tight and the rattle was gone. He paid in cash, asked for a receipt, and then stood there for a moment with the receipt in his hand. You the guy who bought this place for $19, he said. Word traveled fast in a small city. Yeah, that's either the best move anyone's made on this block in 20 years, Danny said, or it's going to be the thing people talk about at your expense for the next 10. Could be both, Ethan said. Danny Voss almost smiled. Could be, he said. He folded the receipt. I'll tell people. I'd appreciate it. The door closed behind him. Ethan stood in the bay with the cash in his hand, enough for parts barely if he was careful, and thought about the system Virgil had built. He thought about how it worked person by person, connection by connection, the invisible structure of a community built from acts of care that no one ever claimed credit for. He went to the pegboard and picked up the torque wrench. He had a softail to finish. But first he opened the 5th ledger, the one he'd been saving, the one whose cover was blank, whose pages he hadn't yet seen. He opened it to the first page. It was empty. All of it. Page after page of blank composition paper waiting. He closed it, set it on the counter beside the receipt book. He understood. The 5th ledger wasn't a record of what Virgil had done, it was a record of what came next. And somewhere in the wall of the service bay behind the pegboard he hadn't fully examined yet, his hand found something that should not have been there. He pulled the pegboard forward, and he stopped breathing. Behind the pegboard there was an envelope taped to the wall. Not a steel box this time. Not a combination lock. Just a plain white envelope, the same kind as the one with his name on it, taped flat against the drywall, with the precise care of someone who had placed it there, intending for it to be found by the right hands and not by careless ones. The pegboard had to be pulled forward at a specific angle, not straight out, but pivoted from the left side, and you had to know to look, or you had to be the kind of person who checked the spaces behind things as a matter of habit. Ethan had always been that kind of person. In the club, it had been a survival skill. In the shop, it was just how he worked. He peeled the envelope off the wall, carefully preserving the tape. He set it on the workbench. He looked at it for a moment. On the front, in Virgil's block capitals, read this before you go any further with the ledgers. He opened it. Inside was a single index card. On it, Virgil had written a name and a phone number, and below that 3 sentences. Her name is Carol Dempsey. She was my bookkeeper for 18 years. She knows everything I chose to tell her, which is most of it. Call her before you make any decisions about the building or the system. She's been expecting your call for 11 years, and she is not a patient woman. Ethan read the card twice. He pulled out his phone. He dialed. It rang twice. I was wondering when you'd call, the woman said. Her voice was sharp and clear. The voice of someone who has spent decades in rooms where information moved fast and imprecision was expensive. You're Ethan Cole. How did you... Ruth called me this morning after she left you. She said you listened to the tape and you didn't run, which is already better than the 2 other people who found that building over the years and ran. A brief pause. 2 people. In 11 years. One was a developer who got through the lock somehow and left when the power didn't work. One was a kid who broke in through the back window, took one look at the ledgers, decided they were account books for something illegal, and left so fast he forgot his jacket. You're number 3. The power worked, Ethan said. I know. I've been paying the utility bill. He stopped. 11 years, she said. Small amount every month. Enough to keep the account live and the panel active. Virgil left money in an account for it. He calculated it would last 15 years before it ran out. You have 4 years left on that clock, so don't take too long getting started. Ethan sat down on the workbench stool. How much did he leave? In the utility account, enough. In the operating account he set up for whoever came, she let a beat pass for effect. She had been waiting 11 years to say this to the right person. $42,000. The shop was very quiet. He saved it over the last 2 years before he closed, Carol Dempsey said. He said the new person would need working capital. He said starting a business from zero is hard, but starting one from nothing is impossible. And he wasn't trying to test anyone's endurance. He was trying to give someone a real chance. Another pause. The account has been drawing minimal interest. It's closer to $44,000 now. Ethan's hand was on the workbench. He could feel the grain of the wood through his palm, the particular solidity of a surface that had been used for work for decades. Why didn't the lawyer tell me about it at the auction? Because the account isn't connected to the property. It's a separate trust account held in the name of Hayes Moto Legacy, LLC, which is a different entity from the dissolved Hayes Moto LLC. Virgil was careful about that. The auction transferred the building. The trust transfers when the trustee, that's me, determines the right conditions have been met. She let that sit. You want to know what the conditions are? Yeah. You stayed, Carol Dempsey said. That's it. You found the box, you listened to the tape, you read the ledgers, and you're still there. That's the entire condition. He heard papers moving on her end of the line. Virgil said a person who understood what the building was for would stay. A person who didn't would leave. He didn't want to create more complicated conditions because he said complicated conditions select for people who are good at meeting conditions, not people who are good for the work. Ethan thought about that. When can I access it? I'll have the paperwork drawn up by end of week. You'll need to come to my office and sign some things. Bring the conditional certificate of ownership from the county auction. She gave him an address. Then she said more quietly, he talked about you know, not often, but when he did, he was specific. He said you were the kind of man who does the necessary thing without calculating whether it benefits him first. He said that was rarer than people think and more valuable than most people understand. He didn't know me, Ethan said. The protest came out rough, not quite as intended. He knew enough. Carol Dempsey's voice didn't soften, but it changed slightly the way a good accountant's voice changes when the numbers finally come out right after a long reconciliation. Come see me Friday. Bring the paperwork. She hung up. Ethan sat on the stool. $44,000. An operating account. A bookkeeper who had been maintaining utilities for 11 years on the instruction of a dead man. He picked up the fourth ledger, the one with his name on it, and turned to the last page Virgil had written on. Below the final entry, there was a note he'd missed the first time, written small in the margin. The system doesn't run on goodwill. It runs on work and capital deployed intelligently. The ledgers are the philosophy. The account is the engine. Don't confuse the two. Mario. He spent the rest of that day and most of the next 2 days on the ledgers. He read them the way he approached a complicated repair, not looking for what he expected to find, but letting the information come in the order it wanted to come in, following connections as they appeared, building his understanding of the whole from the accumulation of specifics. He took notes in the back of the blank fifth ledger with a pen he found in the counter drawer, writing in his own hand alongside the space Virgil had left for what came next. The ledgers were not just case files, they were a manual. Embedded in the entries between the personal histories and the careful accounting of interventions were Virgil's principles, not labeled as such, never presented as rules or philosophy, but present in the pattern of every decision he'd made. Ethan started writing them down because he needed to see them separated from the individual cases, see them as a system. The first principle, as best he could extract it, identify people who are temporarily resource-constrained but fundamentally sound, not permanently limited temporarily. The difference was crucial, and Virgil returned to it repeatedly. A person in a permanent situation needed a different kind of help. A person in a temporary situation needed capital and time, and the belief that the situation was not permanent. Virgil didn't rescue people, he bought them time. The second principle, keep yourself invisible. Not out of modesty, but out of practicality. A person who knows they're being helped changes how they respond to the help. They perform gratitude. They manage the relationship. They think about what they owe instead of what they need to do. Virgil had seen this happen, and it corrupted outcomes every time. The best help was the help that looked like coincidence. The third principle, document everything. Not for personal records, not for accountability, for continuity. The system couldn't die with one person if the records were complete enough for the next person to read and understand and continue. He was the next person. He was reading the documentation. On the morning of the third day, he found the entry that changed the texture of everything he'd understood so far. It was in the second ledger toward the middle between two routine entries about a mechanic named Reyes and a woman named Terry Whitfield. It was longer than most entries written closer together, the block capitals slightly smaller, as if Virgil had known he was filling more space than usual and had adjusted. I have to write about the Harley matter, because if I don't write about it, the next person won't understand why the system is built the way it is, and they'll make the same mistake I almost made, and I won't be here to correct it. Ethan stopped. He read that sentence again. Then he read on. His name was Harlan Briggs. He came to me through a referral not from inside the system, from outside it, from a person who knew what I did in the way that a few people in this city knew, which was imprecisely and with significant misunderstanding. Harlan told me he'd heard I helped people. He said he needed help. He told me a story, long, detailed, sympathetic, about a business that had failed through no fault of his own, about a family in distress, about specific financial pressures that felt urgent and real. I believed him. I made the mistake of believing a story instead of a pattern. The difference between the people in these ledgers and Harlan Briggs was something I didn't understand until afterward. The people in these ledgers were not asking for help. They were people I observed needing help and chose to assist without their knowledge. Harlan was asking, loudly, compellingly, in a way specifically designed to be compelling. He took $14,000 from me over 4 months. Not as charity as loans or what I believed were loans, structured as such in documents I had a lawyer prepare. He defaulted on all of them. When I pursued it through the lawyer, the documents turned out to have problems. Not mistakes, but engineered problems, specific language that rendered them unenforceable. I lost the $14,000. That was recoverable. What was not recoverable was the 6 months I spent angry about it, during which I helped no one fix nothing, and did damage to 3 relationships in this city that had taken years to build, because when you are angry and feeling foolish, you take it out on the people who are available. The lesson is not that you should distrust people. The lesson is that you should trust the pattern, not the story. A person in genuine need almost never leads with their need. They lead with their capability, and their situation reveals itself through observation. Harlan led with his need immediately and completely and emotionally, which in retrospect was the entire warning I needed and chose not to take. Trust what you observe. Be cautious about what you're told. The people who need the system most are usually not the ones telling you they need it. Ethan sat with that entry for a long time. He thought about the word story. He thought about how many times in his own life he'd been given a story by the club, by people in the club, by people outside it, a story that was designed to be compelling, and how many times the compelling part had been the warning he'd needed and missed. He thought about Walsenburg, about an older man on the side of the road who had not told him a story, who had not asked for anything, who had accepted help in silence and ridden away. He thought about Virgil building a $14,000 loss into the manual because the lesson was more valuable than the money. He closed the second ledger. He opened the fifth one, the blank one, and he wrote at the top of the first page, "Trust the pattern, not the story." On Friday, he met Carol Dempsey. Her office was above a title company on the other side of Pueblo, a second-floor space with the particular organized density of someone who has worked in the same place for decades and has a system for everything that looks like chaos from outside and is not. She was in her early 70s, brisk, direct, the kind of woman who had learned long ago that efficiency was its own form of respect. She pushed the paperwork across the desk without preamble. Sign where I've flagged. Initial the pages with a small tab. The account transfer completes within 3 business days. You'll receive access credentials for the trust account via your email. What's your email? He told her. She typed it in. When Virgil set this up, he left instructions for Murphy for me, not just about the money, about the people. She pulled a second folder from the stack on her desk and set it in front of him. 11 years ago, he gave me this. It's a list. People in Pueblo who benefited from the system, who know the system exists, and who have agreed in some cases years after the fact, when Virgil finally told them to participate in continuing it if the building came back to life. She opened the folder. Not all of them are still here. People move, but I've maintained contact with 11 of them. They know that if the right person took over the building, I would call them. Did you call them? Ethan asked. I called them Tuesday morning, Carol said, after Ruth called me to say you'd stayed. She looked at him steadily. You want to know what they said? Yeah. 10 out of 11 said yes immediately. She paused. The 11th asked if you were a good mechanic. Ethan blinked. What did you tell him? I told him Virgil Hayes thought so. She closed the folder. He said that was good enough. Ethan signed the paperwork. Carol walked him through the trust account, structure, the categories Virgil had established, the documentation requirements of the protocols for maintaining the invisibility of the interventions. She spoke quickly and without sentiment, but there was something in the efficiency that felt after the first 10 minutes like its own form of tenderness. She had maintained this thing for 11 years. She had paid bills and tracked accounts and kept a list of 11 people current and waited for a phone to ring, and she had done it without complaint because she believed Virgil had been right about the system and right that the system should continue. One more thing, Shah said when they were nearly done. She opened her desk drawer and produced a manila envelope. Inside was a photograph printed on standard paper, slightly faded with age. He left this with me. He said give it to the right person when they came. Ethan looked at the photograph. It was the road outside Walsenburg, Highway 25 South, the particular stretch south of the city where the land opens up and the mountains are visible on the right, and the plain extends flat to the east. A motorcycle on the shoulder. Two men beside it, one crouched at the engine and one standing with his arms crossed, watching the one who crouched. The one crouching was Ethan, young enough that he looked different, not unrecognizable, but different before whatever the years since had done to his face. Intent on the engine, both hands inside the casing, his whole body organized around the task. The standing man was Virgil Hayes, not the old man from the newspaper photograph. Older than the newspaper photo, actually, this was taken after it. He was watching Ethan work with the expression that Ethan now recognized from the ledger entries, the particular focused attention of someone observing a pattern and drawing a conclusion. He took it from across the highway, Carol said, with a long lens. He told me afterward that he almost didn't stop that morning. He said he wasn't feeling well and he'd considered turning back, but something made him keep going. She took the photograph back and slid it into the envelope. He said, I'm glad I kept going. I found the thing I'd been looking for. Ethan drove back to the building in silence. He parked his bike in the front lot, his bike on the lot that was conditionally his, and sat there for a moment before going in. Virgil Hayes had been looking for him. Not specifically him, not his name or his face, but the thing Ethan represented, the particular configuration of skill and character and circumstance that made a person capable of continuing the system. And he'd found it on the side of the road in a 15-minute repair that Ethan had already forgotten by the time he reached the next town. He went inside. He went to the service bay. He stood in front of the knucklehead. He hadn't touched it yet. He'd worked on the soft tail, worked on the fat bob for Danny Voss, assessed the other two floor bikes, and started a parts list for each of them. But the knucklehead he'd left alone, respecting it the way you respect something that belongs to a category beyond the practical. He put his hand on the tank. All right, he said quietly the way he'd said it to the Softail. Let's see what you need. He crouched down and started examining the engine with his hands and his eyes, the methodical assessment of a mechanic who trusts his senses more than any diagnostic readout. He worked down from the top valve covers, rocker boxes, pushrod tubes, the characteristic architecture of the knucklehead that had given the engine its name, those rocker covers shaped like clenched fists from a certain angle. He was deep in the examination, his hands in the engine case, his mind in the particular focused state that blocked out everything except the machine and its condition when the front door opened. He hadn't locked it. He'd started leaving it unlocked during working hours, the logic being that a building you could walk into was a building that might generate business, and the building was not yet generating enough business to cover what he needed. He heard footsteps cross the front floor. Then they stopped. "Hello," a man's voice. Not Ruth Calloway, not Danny Voss. Someone new. Ethan set down the tool he was holding. He walked to the front. The man standing just inside the door was in his mid-50s. He had the build of someone who had done physical work for most of his life and hadn't stopped, broad in the shoulders, thick through the hands, the particular posture of a working man who has carried weight long enough that the weight has become the posture. He was wearing a gray work shirt with a patch on the chest that Ethan couldn't read from across the room. "You Ethan Cole," the man said. "Yeah. My name's Walt Pritchard." He looked around the front room, and the look on his face was not the casual curiosity of someone checking out a new business. It was the look of someone returning to a place that had been significant and finding it changed in the same simultaneously. "I heard the building was open again." "Working on it." Walt Pritchard took a few steps into the room. He stopped at the Softail and put his hand on the tank briefly, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. "I used to work here," he said. 18 years ago. Virgil hired me when I was..." He stopped, started again. "I was in a situation, a bad one. Not of my own making mostly, but I'd made some choices that made it worse." He looked at the service counter. "Virgil hired me for 6 months. I thought it was just a job." He paused. "I found out later it was something more than that." "You're on the list," Ethan said. Walt Pritchard turned. "What list?" "Carol Dempsey's list. 11 people Virgil told about the system after the fact." "She called you Tuesday." A long silence. Walt Pritchard looked at the floor, then at Ethan. Yeah, she called me." He was working something out in his expression. "I came because I figured whoever was here should know." He stopped again. Then, with the directness of a man who has been thinking about how to say something for 3 days and has decided to just say it. "There's a problem coming. I don't know the specifics, but I know the shape of it. There's a lawyer in this city named Gareth Fowler. He's been watching this property since Virgil closed it. He's made a play for it twice through county channels and got blocked both times. He's going to come at you different now that you've bought it." Ethan kept his face still. "What kind of different?" "Ownership challenge. He'll argue the auction was procedurally deficient. He's got a relationship with someone in the county recorder's office. I don't know who, but it goes back years. Virgil knew about it. Virgil managed it." Walt Pritchard's jaw was set now, the look of someone delivering information they don't enjoy having. "Virgil's dead and the protection he had is gone. You're going to get served papers." "How do you know this?" Ethan asked. "Because Fowler called me last week, before the auction. He said..." Walt stopped, looked at Ethan with the careful honesty of a man who understands that what he's about to say does not reflect well on him. "He said he'd heard through county channels that the building was going to auction. He asked me if I knew anything about the history of the property that could be relevant to a title challenge. He was fishing, seeing what I knew." A pause. "I didn't tell him anything." "But you didn't call anyone either," Ethan said. "Not an accusation, just the observation." "No," Walt said. "I didn't." He looked at the floor. "I should have." Ethan thought about the Harlan Briggs entry, about trust the pattern, not the story. He looked at Walt Pritchard's hands, at the work shirt, at the way the man stood. He thought about what it looked like to be telling the truth in discomfort versus telling a story designed to be compelling. "What do you do now?" Ethan said. "I own a body shop, 3 blocks east." Walt nodded in the direction of it. "Small operation, me and 2 guys." "You made it work." "I did." Walt met his eyes. "Because 18 years ago, Virgil Hayes hired me when no one else would and paid me better than I deserved for the first 2 months, while I found my footing, and I didn't understand why until Carol Dempsey called me in the 2nd year after he closed and explained what the system was." His voice had taken on a texture, not quite emotion, but the controlled weight of someone who feels something deeply and has learned to carry it without display. "I've spent 11 years wondering if I was ever going to get the chance to pay it forward. Tuesday, she told me the building was open again." He looked at Ethan directly. "I came to tell you about Fowler. I also came to tell you that whatever you need, mechanic work, body work referrals, showing up somewhere when it matters, I'm in. The same way Virgil was in for me." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "The lawsuit," Ethan said. "Do you know anyone who would know the specifics of what Fowler's planning?" "Maybe. There's a woman in Fowler's former firm. He went out on his own 3 years ago, and some of the people who stayed didn't leave on good terms with him. I know one of them socially. Find out what you can, Ethan said. Walt nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. He was looking at the knucklehead. Virgil's father's, he said quietly. Yeah. He never wrote it. I worked here 18 months and I never saw him put a leg over it. He just kept it right. Walt looked at the machine for a long moment. He used to say that bike wasn't going anywhere until it had somewhere worth going to. He left. Ethan stood in the front room. The knucklehead sat on its center stand, somewhere worth going to. He went back to the service bay and picked up the tool he'd set down and went back to his examination. His hands knew what to do. They moved through the inspection with the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades of mechanical work, reading the engine the way he read the ledgers, not looking for what he expected, but letting the condition reveal itself. The engine was sound. He could feel it in the tolerances, in the way the components related to each other, in the absence of the particular kinds of wear that indicated neglect. Virgil's father had kept it right, and Virgil had kept it right after him. 2 generations of care expressing itself in the condition of metal and rubber and gasket material that should have degraded far beyond this point. He sat back on his heels. He was thinking about Gareth Fowler. He was thinking about a lawyer who had made 2 plays for this property through county channels and had both plays blocked by Virgil Hayes, and who had called Walt Pritchard last week to fish for information, which meant the play was already in motion before the auction, which meant Fowler had known the auction was coming, had possibly tried to prevent it or delay. It had failed and had watched a man with no money and no legal resources buy the building for $19, which meant Fowler was not going to come at this casually. Ethan got up. He went to the front counter. He picked up the receipt book and found the pen. He turned to a clean page and he started writing, not a receipt, not a ledger entry, a list. Every person he had encountered in the past week who had a connection to this building. Ruth Calloway, Carol Dempsey, Danny Voss, Walt Pritchard, the 10 other names on Carol's list that he hadn't yet put faces to. 11 people who had been waiting 11 years. He looked at the list. Virgil Hayes had spent 22 years building something invisible, something that operated below the surface of ordinary life, something that held the city the way a foundation holds a building, present everywhere, visible nowhere. He had built it person by person, act by act, debt by debt that nobody owed and everybody carried. And now there was a lawyer who wanted to take the building. And the building was not just a building. Ethan put the cap on the pen. He thought about what it meant to fight without resources against a man with resources. He thought about the ways he'd been in that position before and the outcomes. He thought about the chapter meeting in Albuquerque and the parking lot in the Drift North. He thought about what Virgil had written. The system he built is still alive. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. This is Walt. My contact at Fowler's old firm just called back. He's filing Monday. Title challenge, procedural deficiency in the auction, plus a claim that the property was never legally available for surplus auction due to an unresolved lien. He's been holding that lien argument for years. Waited for the right moment. Ethan read the text twice. He thought about $44,000 in a trust account. He thought about a retired attorney who was on Carol's list. He thought about the particular irony of a lawyer trying to take a building that a dead man had spent 22 years quietly making indestructible. He typed back, "Thank you. I need to make some calls." He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the knucklehead. He thought, "Virgil, you built this thing to last. Let's find out if you were right." He picked up the list he'd made. He went to the counter drawer and found the community service commendation article. He'd printed the one with a small photograph of Virgil. He's shaking hands with the city official, and he set it on the counter beside the list. He looked at Virgil's face in the photograph. The composed attention, the refusal to perform ease. Then he picked up his phone and called Carol Dempsey. She answered on the first ring. "Fowler's filing Monday," Ethan said. "Title challenge plus a lien argument he's been holding. I need to know who on your list is a lawyer." A brief pause. "James Whitfield," Carol said. "Retired. He was a property attorney for 31 years. He and his wife Sandra Oaks," Ethan said. "Secondest ledger. She took his name after they married." Carol's voice held a note of something. "Virgil would have, yes. He would have appreciated that detail." She paused. "James knows about the system. He's known for 8 years. He told Virgil that if the building ever needed legal defense, he would provide it. I need you to call him tonight, Ethan said. I already did, Carol Dempsey said. Tuesday morning, right after I called the others. He stood there. Ethan, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name. Virgil spent 22 years making sure this building could not be taken easily. He knew Fowler, he knew the lien argument. He resolved it once through a counterfiling in 2009 that technically still stands. James knows about it. James has the documentation. A pause. Virgil didn't leave you defenseless. He left you a system. I know, Ethan said. Do you? He looked around the building, the covered knucklehead, the tools on the pegboard, the coffee cup on the counter. The calendar on the wall stopped in October 12 years ago, holding the breath of a building that had been waiting for the right person to come through the door and understand what it was for. I'm starting to, he said. He hung up. He went back to work. The papers arrived Monday morning at 7:42, not through the mail. A process server, young, uncomfortable, the expression of someone who does an unpleasant job and hasn't yet learned to make peace with it, knocked on the front door while Ethan was in the service bay, pulling the carb on the second-floor bike. He heard the knock, wiped his hands on the shop rag, walked out front, and opened the door. The kid held out an envelope. Ethan Cole. Yeah, you've been served. He said it the way he'd been trained to say it quickly and without inflection, and then he was already turning away before Ethan had fully closed his hand around the envelope. Ethan stood in the doorway. He looked at the envelope. Legal-sized. The return address was a firm name he didn't recognize, Fowler and Associates, LLC, and the address was a building 2 miles east of where he was standing. He went back inside. He set the envelope on the service counter beside the receipt book and the fifth ledger and the community service photograph and the list of 11 names he'd been adding to over the past 3 days as Carol Dempsey made her calls and the people on the list began quietly and without announcement to materialize. He didn't open the envelope yet. He went back to the carburetor. He worked for 40 minutes, the focused work of a man who understands that panic is expensive and the antidote to panic is the thing directly in front of you that needs doing. He cleaned the carb, rebuilt the float assembly, set the needle clip, reinstalled. He primed the system, ran through the checks, and when he turned the key and the engine caught and settled into its idle, the sound of it, the specific rumble of an engine that hasn't run in 12 years, finding its rhythm again, did something to the tension in his chest that no amount of reasoning had managed to do. He let it run for 3 minutes. He listened to it. He made adjustments by ear, the way Virgil had probably made adjustments by the sound and the feel and the long experience of knowing what right sounds like and what wrong sounds like and everything in between. He shut it down. He went to the counter and opened the envelope. The filing was 31 pages. Ethan was not a lawyer and had never needed to be, but he was a man who had spent 11 years operating inside an organization with a complex internal structure, and that organization had taught him to read documents carefully, to find the specific language where the real content lived, to distinguish between what something said and what it was designed to do. He read the filing twice. The core argument was what Walt had described, a procedural challenge to the auction's validity combined with a lien claim. But the procedural challenge was more specific than he'd expected. Fowler was arguing that the county had failed to provide adequate notice of the auction to parties with a potential interest in the property, specifically his client had identified in the filing as Meridian Property Holdings, LLC. The lien claim was attached as an exhibit, a second mortgage instrument dated 14 years ago, predating Virgil's closing by 2 years, recorded against the property by a lender called Southwest Capital Group. Ethan had never heard of Meridian Property Holdings or Southwest Capital Group. He photographed every page of the filing with his phone. He texted the photographs to Carol Dempsey with a message. Filing just arrived. Sending you the pages. Who is Meridian Property Holdings? Her reply came back in 4 minutes. I don't know, calling James now. He went back to work. He didn't have the option of not working. The building was generating cash now. Slowly through the repair business that Danny Voss's word of mouth had started, and which had grown in the 2 weeks since he had opened the doors to a level that covered his daily costs, if nothing unexpected happened. Unexpected things kept happening. That was the nature of the situation. By 10 o'clock, he had 3 bikes in the bay and a 4th scheduled for afternoon drop-off. Two of the three were straightforward routine service, the kind of work any competent mechanic could do in his sleep. The third was more interesting, a 2001 Road King with an electrical fault that had defeated two previous shops, in which the owner, a woman named Patrice Monroe, who drove a hard bargain and had the focused frustration of someone who has been given wrong answers before, had described with a precision that told Ethan she knew her bike well, even if she couldn't diagnose it herself. He was tracing the fault when James Whitfield arrived. Ethan heard the front door and came out from the bay, wiping his hands. The man standing just inside was in his mid-70s, lean with the careful posture of someone who has spent decades in courtrooms and never lost the habit of being composed in rooms where things mattered. He was carrying a leather briefcase that had been used long enough to have developed character. "Ethan Cole," he said. It wasn't a question. "James Whitfield." He set the briefcase on the counter and opened it. "Carol sent me the filing. I've read it." He looked up. "Do you have coffee? I can make some." "Please do." Ethan made coffee on the small machine he'd bought with the first week's cash, a basic drip maker that produced something functional, if not distinguished. He set a mug in front of James Whitfield and leaned against the counter with his own. James Whitfield had the filing spread on the counter in front of him with 3 pages of his own notes beside it. He looked at the filing the way Ethan looked at a broken engine, not with alarm, but with the diagnostic attention of someone who has seen this category of problem before and knows that it has a structure that can be understood. Meridian Property Holdings. James said is a shell company. It was registered in Nevada 14 months ago. I've already traced it 3 levels, and I'll need more time to get to the beneficial owner, but the registration dates are suggestive. Fowler went out on his own 3 years ago. He started moving on this property through county channels about 14 months ago, which is precisely when Meridian was registered. He looked at Ethan. He set up the entity specifically for this. "Which means he's not just a lawyer with a client," Ethan said. "He is the client. That's my assessment." James picked up one of the filing pages. "The lien, Southwest Capital Group. I know this lien. Virgil showed me this document in 2009. He told me about it, and I examined it at the time, and we counterfiled based on a specific statutory argument about the recording procedures Southwest used." He set the page down. "The counter-filing is still in the record. Fowler knows about it. He's arguing in this challenge that the counter-filing had a deficiency of its own, a technical issue with the notarization on one of the supporting documents." "Does it?" Ethan asked. "Have a deficiency?" James Whitfield looked at him steadily. "The notary whose stamp appears on the 2009 document retired in 2011 and died in 2015. The commission records for that notary were archived, and there is a question about whether the archive is complete." He paused. "Fowler has done his homework." Ethan set down his coffee. "Is the notarization deficient?" "Technically, there's an argument. A better argument is that the underlying recording deficiency in Southwest Capital's original lien is dispositive regardless of any subsequent procedural issues because a fatally defective original document cannot be cured by the debtor's response to it." James said this with the careful precision of a man who has spent his entire career in the space between what the law says and what it does. "My argument is stronger, but Fowler's argument is not frivolous, and if he gets in front of the right judge..." He stopped. "What does that mean?" Ethan said. "Right judge." A brief silence. James Whitfield picked up his coffee. "It means that Pueblo County has 4 district court judges, and 2 of them would look at this case, see the clean legal argument, and decide it on the merits, in which case we have a strong probability of prevailing." He set the cup down. "One of them has a relationship with Fowler that goes back to before Fowler left his previous firm, and that judges' decisions in property matters have historically correlated with Fowler's position in ways that are probably not coincidental. Can we challenge the judge's assignment? On what grounds? I need a documented conflict of interest, not a pattern I've observed over 20 years of practice." James closed the briefcase. "I want to be clear with you. We have a strong legal position. What we have less of is time and certainty. Fowler can move for a preliminary injunction that freezes your control of the property while the challenge is pending. If he gets that injunction, you can't operate the building while the case works through the court. At the pace things move, that could be 18 months. Ethan looked at the building. He looked at the 3 bikes in the service bay and the knucklehead on its center stand, and the fifth ledger on the counter with 4 pages of his own notes in it. He thought about 18 months. "What do we need?" he said. "Evidence that the original Southwest Capital lien was defectively recorded. I have the argument, but I need the original recording documentation from the county, the specific submission records from the time of filing, which would show the procedural deficiency. Those records should be in the county archive." James paused. "The county archive is managed through the recorder's office." Walt's text from Friday. "He's got a relationship with someone in the county recorder's office." "That's a problem," Ethan said. James Whitfield looked at him. "Carol told me about Walt's contacts information." "Yes, it is." He closed the filing. "I've been a proper attorney in this county for 31 years. I know where records are filed, and I know who has access to them. I also know that records that inconvenience certain interests have a history of being difficult to locate in the county system." His voice was precise and level, carrying the specific weight of a man saying a thing he has known for years and has never previously said out loud to anyone useful. "If Fowler's contact in the recorder's office moves those records before I can access them, the argument becomes substantially harder to make." "How long do we have?" "He filed today. He'll move for the preliminary injunction within 72 hours. I need to file a response within that window to have any chance of defeating the injunction at the initial hearing." Ethan stood there for a moment. Then he said, "Carol's list. Is there anyone on it with a connection to the county recorder's office?" James Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. "Why do you ask?" "Because Virgil spent 22 years building a system. He knew Fowler, he knew the lien, he knew the archive problem." Ethan looked at the photograph of Virgil on the counter. He built counter filings, he left documentation, he left a list of 11 people. He paused. He didn't leave things without a reason. James Whitfield was quiet for a moment. He reached into his briefcase and produced a piece of paper, not the filing, something else. "Carol gave me the list Tuesday. I've been going through it." He looked at the paper. "Number 7, a woman named Diane Forsyth. She was a county records clerk for 19 years. She retired 4 years ago." He looked up. Virgil paid her medical bills in 2008 after she was diagnosed with something significant, through a third-party arrangement. She found out about it 2 years later. He paused. "She knows every filing system, every archive location, and every procedural backdoor in that recorder's office. She also has friends who still work there." Ethan looked at him. "Carol called her Tuesday," James said, "like she called everyone else." He set the paper down. "Diane Forsyth called me this morning before I came here. She said she's been waiting to do something useful for 11 years and she wants to know what I need." The building was very quiet for a moment. Then Ethan said, "Call her back. Tell her we need the original Southwest Capital recording submission documents, whatever it takes." James Whitfield allowed himself something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. "I already did." He closed his briefcase. "She's going in tomorrow morning." The next 72 hours ran at a pace that felt nothing like Ethan's normal pace, which had been for 3 years the slow and slightly defeated pace of a man moving through obligations without momentum. These 72 hours had momentum of a different kind, the sharp, clarifying momentum of a situation with a deadline, where every hour matters and every action either helps or doesn't. James Whitfield filed a preliminary response to the challenge by Tuesday afternoon, buying time and establishing Ethan's standing. He did it from the building's front counter because Ethan had asked him to, and James Whitfield, it turned out, was the kind of man who worked where the work was. Diane Forsyth accessed the county archive on Tuesday morning and found the original Southwest Capital submission records in a file box that had been marked for transfer to off-site storage. A transfer that was scheduled for Wednesday, which was either coincidence or the kind of thing that happens when someone with access to a record system knows that a specific file is about to become legally important. She photographed every page and sent the photographs to James's secure email before noon. The photographs confirmed what James had argued. The original recording submission had a procedural deficiency in the witness attestation that, under the statute in effect at the time of filing, rendered the lien recording legally invalid. Southwest Capital had filed incorrectly, and the defect was never cured because nobody with a reason to look had looked until Virgil had looked in 2009. And what Virgil had found was now in James Whitfield's hands in the form of clear photographic evidence. Tuesday evening, Ethan's phone started doing something it hadn't done since he arrived in Pueblo. It rang and rang and rang, not Fowler, not legal threats, People. Danny Voss called to ask if there was anything he could do. Ruth Calloway called and didn't ask. She simply said she was coming by Wednesday morning, and she was bringing food because she'd noticed Ethan hadn't been leaving for meals. Walt Pritchard called to say his contact at Fowler's old firm had confirmed that Fowler had specifically requested the file transfer to off-site storage through a contact, and that the request had originated before the filing, which meant he'd known what was in those records and had moved to make them inaccessible. Walt said he'd be willing to provide a sworn statement about the conversation with his contact if James needed it. James said he needed it. By Wednesday morning, the preliminary injunction hearing was 6 hours away. Ethan was in the service bay at 5 in the morning because sleep had become an abstraction he couldn't afford. He was working on Patrice Monroe's Road King the electrical fault that had defeated 2 other shops because the work was necessary, and because the work kept his hands busy, and his hands being busy kept the rest of him organized. He'd found the fault at 2 in the morning, a ground wire with an intermittent break in the insulation that created a ghost circuit under specific load conditions, the kind of fault that hides when you're looking for it and reveals itself only when you're not. He'd fixed it in 20 minutes once he found it. He'd spent the remaining hours doing the other maintenance items the bike needed because it was there and the tools were there and the time was there. Ruth Calloway arrived at 7 with a paper bag from a diner 4 blocks away. She set it on the counter without ceremony and poured the 2 cups from the coffee machine without asking. "Did you sleep?" she said. "Some." She looked at him with the practical assessment of a woman who has raised children and therefore recognizes certain conditions on site. "Eat something," she said. "You'll think better." He ate. She was right. "Are you scared?" she said while he ate. He considered the question honestly, which Ruth Calloway seemed to invite by asking things directly and waiting for real answers. "Not the way I expected to be," he said. "I've been in situations where I was going to lose something and I knew it, and there was nothing to do about it. This doesn't feel like that." "What does it feel like?" He thought about it. "Like finding out a machine has more capacity than you thought it did," he said. "You put the load on it, and it holds." Ruth Calloway looked at him for a moment. "Virgil would have liked that answer," she said, not sentimentally, as assessment. James Whitfield arrived at 8:30 with 2 associates he'd apparently called into service because the timeline required more hands. Both were younger lawyers, precise and prepared, carrying the kind of organized documentation that suggested they'd been working through the night. James introduced them briefly and then spread the response filing on the counter and walked Ethan through what it said and what it argued and what the likely outcomes of the hearing were. The picture James painted was better than Monday. Not guaranteed, nothing was guaranteed, but the evidence from the archive combined with Walt Pritchard's statement and the timeline of the file transfer request built a case that went beyond the legal argument about the lien. It suggested that Fowler had attempted to obstruct access to evidence, which was a different kind of problem for Fowler, the kind that could follow a lawyer beyond a single case. "Best case," James said. "The judge rules in your favor on the injunction today. The challenge is dismissed on the merits within 90 days and Fowler faces a bar complaint." He paused. "Worst case, we get the judge with the relationship he grants the injunction anyway despite our evidence, and we appeal, which is slow and expensive." "What's your read on which judge?" Ethan asked. "I requested a specific assignment based on a technicality in the filing that gives me some standing to make that request." James's voice was careful. "We'll know when we get there." At 9:45, Ethan locked the building and drove to the courthouse. He'd expected to go alone. He was wrong. Walt Pritchard was there in a suit jacket that looked like it had been brought out of storage for the occasion, standing outside the courthouse entrance with his hands in his pockets. Diane Forsythe was there. Ethan recognized her from a photograph Carol had texted him, a woman in her 60s with the compact, self-possessed look of someone who had spent decades navigating institutional systems and knew exactly where every lever was. Carol Dempsey was there in the particular composed state of a bookkeeper who has spent 11 years waiting for this day and intends to observe it with the same precision she'd applied to the accounts. And beside Carol, a man Ethan didn't recognize, mid-50s, the build of someone who had done outdoor work most of his life wearing a clean flannel shirt. He looked at Ethan and extended his hand. "Marcus Bellows," he said. Ethan shook his hand. The first name in the first ledger. Ethan had read his entire story. He had never expected to stand across from him in a courthouse parking lot. "Carol called me," Marcus said. "I drove down from Denver last night. He said it the way people say things that required effort and that they don't want acknowledged as effort. Just information. Virgil helped me when I didn't know I needed help. I figure showing up is the least of what I owe. Two more people Ethan didn't yet know arrived in the same car. Then another car. By the time James Whitfield said it was time to go in, there were 9 of them standing outside that courthouse. 9 people who had been touched by a system they didn't know they were inside until years after the fact, who had been called by a bookkeeper 4 days ago, who had made their way here through routes that had required rearranging their lives in the specific way that matters call for. Ethan looked at them. He thought about Virgil's letter. The system he built is still alive. Give it time. He hadn't given it time. He'd given it 11 days. James Whitfield put a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. Let's go in. The courtroom was not dramatic in the way that courtrooms are in films. It was a working room, fluorescent, institutional, carrying the particular bureaucratic weight of a space where difficult things are decided routinely and without ceremony. The gallery was nearly empty when they filed in. Fowler was already at his table, a man in his mid-50s with the groomed, confident bearing of someone who expected rooms to arrange themselves around him. He had 2 people with him, a younger associate and a woman Ethan didn't recognize who was taking notes. Fowler looked at the group filing in behind Ethan and James and his associates. He looked at them for a moment and something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not yet, but recognition of a variable he hadn't accounted for. Ethan sat at the table beside James Whitfield. He did not look at Fowler again. The judge entered. Not the judge James had been concerned about. A woman in her early 60s, precise and unhurried, the specific kind of attention in her face that Ethan had learned to recognize in people who were actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. James Whitfield leaned close and said quietly, Judge Patricia Reyes, she decided 2 major property cases I was involved in. She rules on the law. The hearing began. Fowler argued first, and he argued well. Ethan would give him that. The man knew how to organize a case, how to move a judge through a sequence of logic, how to present the procedural argument about the auction with enough technical precision to sound like the only reasonable position. He was smooth and confident and structured, and Ethan sat there and listened and thought, this is a man telling a story. He thought about Virgil. Trust the pattern, not the story, James Whitfield responded. He didn't match Fowler's smoothness. He was more deliberate, more specific, the particular quality of a man who has done this for 30 years and understands that a judge like Patricia Reyes is not moved by fluency, but by precision. He laid out the lean argument methodically, the original recording deficiency, the photographic evidence from the archive, the counterfiling from 2009. He laid it out the way you'd show someone a machine and explain why each component functions the way it does. Then he said something that changed the temperature of the room. Your Honor, I'd also like to bring to the court's attention information that has emerged regarding the availability of the archival records central to this matter. His voice didn't change, same deliberate pace, same precise delivery. The original submission records for the Southwest Capitol lien were scheduled for transfer to off-site storage on Wednesday of this week. That transfer was requested through the county recorder's office before the filing of this challenge by a party we have reason to believe was acting on the instruction of or in coordination with the challenging party. He produced a document and slid it to the clerk. We have a sworn statement from a former county records employee identifying the specific sequence of events. We have the county transfer request documentation. And we have the archival records themselves, which were accessed and photographed before the transfer occurred. Fowler was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor, this is Mr. Fowler, Judge Reyes said. Her voice had a quality, not loud, not sharp, the particular quality of a judge who does not need volume to establish authority. Sit down. Fowler sat down. Judge Reyes looked at the document James had submitted. She looked at it for a while. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something important is happening, and everyone present understands it simultaneously. She looked up. Mr. Whitfield, are you suggesting that evidence potentially relevant to this proceeding was subject to an attempt at suppression? I'm presenting the chronology, Your Honor, and asking the court to draw its own conclusions. Another silence. Judge Reyes looked at Fowler. Mr. Fowler, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to the chronology Mr. Whitfield has presented. I want you to think carefully before you speak. Fowler spoke carefully. He denied involvement with the transfer request. He called it coincidence. He maintained his argument on the lien and the auction procedural challenge. He was careful and controlled, but there was something underneath the control, now the specific quality of a performance, where the performer knows the audience has stopped believing. Judge Reyes listened. She made notes. Then she said, "I'm going to take a brief recess." 17 minutes. Ethan sat at the table and did not speak and did not move and breathed with the controlled deliberateness of a man who has learned that the moments where you have no control are the moments where your response to having no control is the only thing left to manage. James Whitfield sat beside him in similar stillness. Behind them in the gallery, 9 people waited. Judge Reyes returned. "The motion for preliminary injunction is denied," she said without preamble. She looked at her notes. "The court finds that the legal challenge to the auction's validity does not meet the threshold required for emergency injunctive relief, particularly in light of the documented counterfiling from 2009 and the archival evidence regarding the original lien recording." She paused. "The court further notes for the record that the circumstances surrounding the scheduling of the archival record transfer warrant review. I'm issuing a preservation order covering all county records related to the Southwest Capitol filing effective immediately." She looked at Fowler. "The underlying challenge may proceed on the merits schedule, but Mr. Cole retains operational control of the property pending final resolution." She looked around the room once briefly. "We're adjourned." She left. Ethan sat at the table for a moment after she was gone. James Whitfield put his hand on the table, not on Ethan's arm, just on the table between them, the restrained gesture of a man who feels something strongly and expresses it precisely. "That's a good day," he said. "Is it over?" Ethan said. "The injunction is over. The challenge is not. Fowler will continue." James began organizing his papers. "But continuing costs money and professional exposure. The preservation order is a warning. A careful man at this point considers the cost-benefit." He looked at Ethan. "Fowler is not always careful, but he's always calculating." Ethan stood up. He turned around. The 9 people in the gallery were already on their feet. Marcus Bellows was talking to Walt Pritchard in the low voice of 2 people who have never met but recognize each other as belonging to the same category of thing. Ruth Calloway was standing with Carol Dempsey, both of them with the composed expression of people for whom the outcome confirmed something they had believed and not the other way around. Diane Forsythe caught Ethan's eye. She nodded once. That was all. He nodded back. Outside the courthouse in the fall air, with the mountains visible to the west, in the particular clarity that Pueblo carries after a cold front, the group stood together on the steps. There was no celebration, no dramatic release of tension. People who have done difficult things together often express the completion of those things quietly through the particular kind of proximity that doesn't require words. Walt Pritchard stood beside Ethan. "What happens now?" he said. "We go back to work," Ethan said. Walt looked at him, a small nod. "That's what Virgil would have said." Marcus Bellows, who was preparing to drive back to Denver, stopped and shook Ethan's hand again before he left. "I read about you," he said. "In the Ledger. Virgil wrote about you." Ethan looked at him. "He said you were the right person." Marcus said it without performance, just as a fact that had turned out to be confirmed. He was right. He walked to his car. Carol Dempsey was the last to leave. She stood with Ethan on the steps after the others had gone. "Fowler's not finished," she said. "I know. James will watch him. So will I." She picked up her bag. "Virgil always said the work was never finished. That's not a warning. It's a description." She looked at him. "You understand that now?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "I understand it." She left. He stood on the courthouse steps alone for a moment. The city moved around him, traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary motion of a Tuesday afternoon in a working city. He had been in Pueblo for less than 3 weeks. He had bought a building for $19 and found a dead man's life's work inside it and been handed the continuation of that work without being asked whether he wanted it. He had not been asked. He had raised his hand. He pulled out his phone and looked at the time. He had 3 bikes in the service bay. Patrice Monroe's Road King was done. The other 2 needed afternoon work. He had a parts order arriving at the shop that he needed to be there to receive. He put the phone away. He walked to his bike. He rode back to Old Thatcher Avenue. He unlocked the front door, went inside, and set his jacket on the counter. He looked at the fifth ledger. He picked up the pen. He opened to the page where he'd been writing, and he added a line below the last entry. Today, 9 people who didn't know each other came to a courthouse because a dead man helped them when they needed it. The system worked, not because it was powerful, because it was real. He put the pen down, he went to the service bay, he picked up the wrench, he went back to work. 3 weeks after the courthouse, Fowler went quiet. Not gone, James Whitfield made that clear when he called on a Thursday afternoon to deliver his assessment of the situation. The challenge was still technically active in the court system, the underlying case still on the docket, Fowler's name still on the filing. But the motion practice had stopped. The aggressive timeline had collapsed. The man who had filed 31 pages on a Monday morning and moved for emergency injunctive relief within 72 hours had, in the 3 weeks since Judge Reyes denied that relief and issued the preservation order, done absolutely nothing. He's calculating, James said, which is what I expected. The bar complaint I filed last week over the archive situation is now a factor in his calculation. A pause. A careful man looks at his exposure and decides whether the asset is worth the cost. The preservation order made his main evidentiary approach unavailable. The bar complaint added professional risk. The courthouse appearance, 9 people showing up, the documentation we produced, told him that this is not an isolated man with no resources. James's voice was careful and precise, the way it always was. He may try something else. He may not. But the immediate threat is contained. Ethan thanked him and hung up. He stood in the service bay with his phone in his hand and thought about what contained meant. Not finished, not resolved. Contained. He had learned in his years in the club and in the years since to understand the difference between a problem that was gone and a problem that was waiting, and to treat the waiting ones with the same attention he gave the active ones. But contained was something. Contained was enough to work with. He went back to the knucklehead. He'd been working on it in the hours between paying jobs the way a man works on something that matters to him, not with urgency but with consistency, coming back to it every day, adding a little more to what he understood and what he'd restored, letting the machine tell him what it needed in the particular language of old metal and old design. The knucklehead spoke differently than the modern bikes. It required a different kind of listening, slower and more patient, the kind that didn't look for answers so much as wait for them. The engine was sound. He'd confirmed that in the first detailed inspection. The primary drive was tight. The transmission shifted cleanly through every gear. What needed work was the fuel system, the electrical and the cosmetic elements that age and time had affected chrome, that had oxidized past surface treatment and needed professional attention, leather that had dried past the point where conditioning alone would restore it. He had a contact for the chrome. Walt Pritchard had connected him with a restoration specialist in Pueblo who had worked on vintage bikes for 30 years and who it turned out was someone Virgil had referred work to repeatedly over the years. The man's name was Ed Garza, and when Ethan called him and said Virgil Hayes' name, there was a silence on the line before Ed said quietly that he'd come by and take a look, and that whatever Virgil's building needed from him, the price would be right. The leather was different. He'd found a supplier through the parts channels he'd been establishing, but the specific pieces, the seat, the saddle, bag faces, the grip wraps needed to be made to the original specifications. And that meant finding someone who worked with those specifications, which meant research and patience, and the kind of careful sourcing that Virgil had apparently done as a matter of course, but which Ethan was learning from scratch. He was learning a lot of things from scratch. That was the texture of the day's now work and learning the two things cycling through each other the way they do when a person is building something real. He fixed bikes that came through the door, and the money from that work went into the operating account alongside the trust funds Carol had transferred, and the combination meant that the building was not just surviving, but slowly accumulating the resources to do what Virgil had built it to do. He'd opened the fifth ledger's first real entry 2 weeks after the courthouse. A kid named Tommy Reyes, 19, had come in looking for work, had no certification and no formal training, but had been taking apart and reassembling small engines since he was 12, the self-taught kind of knowledge that has gaps but also has depth. Ethan had given him 3 diagnostic tests, not written practical, show me what you see tests on 3 different bikes with 3 different problems, and Tommy had found 2 of the 3 without being told what to look for. He'd hired him at $11 an hour, which was below what he wanted to pay eventually, and above what Tommy had been making at the gas station on Fortino. He'd started Tommy on the straightforward service work and watched the way Virgil had watched, not looking for what he expected, but letting the pattern reveal itself. The pattern revealed itself quickly. Tommy worked with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had no bad habits to unlearn, only gaps to fill. He asked precise questions, not many but precise, the questions of a person who had thought about what they didn't know before asking about it. He made mistakes and acknowledged them directly without excuse or performance, which was rarer than it should have been, and which Ethan noted in the fifth ledger with the same block capital precision he'd absorbed from Virgil's method. He didn't tell Tommy about the ledger system, not yet. Virgil hadn't told anyone until years after the fact, and there was wisdom in that timing that Ethan was beginning to understand from the inside. The help worked better when it wasn't performing itself. What he did tell Tommy 6 days after he hired him was that the shop had a policy. Tommy was at the workbench eating lunch. Ethan leaned against the parts counter and said, "If someone comes in and they need work done and they can't pay, we do the work." Tommy looked at him. "Every time, within reason. Use judgment about the situation. But the default is we do the work." Tommy chewed, thought about it. "What if they take advantage of it?" "Some will," Ethan said. "Most won't. The ones who won't are the reason for the policy." Tommy nodded slowly. He had the look of someone filing information away in a place where it would do work later. Kahia said, "Not performance, not enthusiasm, just understanding and acceptance." "Okay." Ethan went back to the knucklehead. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, not from Fowler. From an address in Colorado Springs, handwritten on plain paper, the envelope addressed to the owner, Hayes Moto. Old Thatcher Avenue, Pueblo, Colorado. He opened it at the counter. Inside was a single page handwritten from a man who identified himself as Robert Calloway. Ruth Calloway's son, the one she'd told him about, the one Virgil had hired 20 years ago, the master mechanic in Colorado Springs, with his own shop and 3 employees. Ethan hadn't met him. Ruth had mentioned him once early and then not again. He'd assumed the son knew about the building's reopening through his mother, but had his own life to attend to and no particular reason to make contact. He was wrong. Mr. Cole Robert had written, "My mother told me the building was open again. I've been thinking about how to say what I want to say for 3 weeks, and I've decided the best way is directly. When I was 23, I was in a situation I'm not going to describe in detail because it doesn't matter now. What matters is that Virgil Hayes hired me when I had no right to expect anyone to hire me. He paid me well and he expected a lot, and he didn't make allowances for the situation I was coming from. He just expected the work, which was exactly what I needed and didn't know I needed. I've had my own shop for 12 years. I have 3 employees. One of them I hired in a situation that reminded me of my own. A young man who had no business being given a chance by anyone and who needed exactly the opportunity I gave him. I didn't understand until my mother explained the system that I had been doing what Virgil did without knowing I was doing it. That the thing he'd given me had been quietly passing forward through my own decisions. I'm writing because I want you to know that the system, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't stop at the edges of what's in those ledgers. It moves, it gets inside people, and it changes how they make decisions. And those decisions change other people, and none of it is recorded anywhere or attributed to anyone. Virgil never knew about the young man I hired. He was gone by then. But Virgil is why that young man has a job. That young man now manages the service floor of my shop. I thought you should know, whatever you're building there, it's already bigger than the building. Ethan set the letter down. He read it again. He put it beside the 5th ledger, and he sat there for a long time, not thinking in the organized way he usually thought, but in the diffuse, wide-open way that happens when information arrives that is too large for the usual processing. The system moved. It got inside people. It reproduced itself through decisions that nobody recorded as connected to the original act decisions that looked like independent choices, but were shaped underneath by something someone else had done years earlier. He thought about the ripple physics of it, not metaphorically, but as a practical reality. Virgil had helped Marcus Bellows. Marcus had probably helped someone in ways Marcus might not even frame as help, just as ordinary decency. That person had probably passed something forward. Virgil had helped Robert Calloway, who had hired a young man who now managed a shop floor, who was probably in his daily work shaping the professional standards and habits of other people. None of it traceable, none of it attributable, all of it real. He picked up the pen and opened the fifth ledger. He wrote, "The system is not the building or the ledgers or the account. The system is the decision. Every good decision made by someone Virgil helped is part of the system. Every good decision made by someone those people helped is part of the system. It's not a local thing. It never was." He set the pen down. He picked up his phone and called Carol Dempsey. "I got a letter from Robert Calloway," he said. "I know he called me before he sent it." "You've been tracking this," Ethan said. "The downstream effects. The people who were helped and then helped others." "Where I can," Carol said. "Virgil asked me to. Not systematically, I'm a bookkeeper, not a sociologist. But when I encounter evidence of it, I note it." A pause. "You want to know how far it goes?" "Yeah. I've documented 12 second-generation cases. People who were helped by people Virgil helped. 2 third-generation cases, I'm less certain about those because the connection is harder to trace." She paused again. "Ethan, I've been doing this for 11 years while the building was closed. You've been open for less than 2 months." He let that sit. "The second-generation cases," he said, "are any of them in Pueblo, 3 of them. Send me what you have." The call that changed the shape of everything came on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the courthouse. Not from Carol, not from James or Walt or Ruth. From a number he didn't recognize with the Colorado Springs area code. He answered it in the service bay phone wedged between his shoulder and ear while he kept both hands on the work. "Is this Ethan Cole?" A man's voice, older, carrying the particular quality of someone who has thought carefully about making this call. "Yeah." "My name is Arthur Meade. I don't know if that means anything to you." It didn't. "Go ahead, Mr. Meade." "I was Gareth Fowler's senior partner," Arthur Meade said before he left the firm 3 years ago. Ethan's hands went still. He set down the tool. "I've been following the challenge to your property," Arthur Meade said. "The bar complaint James Whitfield filed came across my desk as part of the Bar Association's preliminary review process. I'm on the ethics committee." A pause long enough to be deliberate. "I have information relevant to the complaint that James Whitfield doesn't have. Information about the pattern of Fowler's conduct during his time at our firm, specifically regarding property matters in Pueblo County." Ethan said nothing. He waited. "This isn't a comfortable call for me to make," Arthur Meade said. "Fowler was my partner for 11 years. The legal profession has a complicated relationship with loyalty." His voice was precise, but carried something underneath the weight of a decision that had cost him something. But the bar complaint, combined with Judge Reyes's preservation order, indicates that what Fowler is doing has moved past a threshold I'm willing to be silent about. A pause. "I have documentation, internal firm records from the period of Fowler's employment that show a pattern of conduct in Pueblo County property matters that is relevant to your situation and to the bar investigation." "Why are you calling me?" Ethan said. "If you have information for the bar, call the bar." "I am calling the bar," Arthur Meade said. "I'm calling you because the documentation I have is also relevant to the title challenge itself, not just the conduct question. There are communications between Fowler and Southwest Capital Group that predate the original lien filing by 3 months." He let that land. "The lien may not have been an independent financial instrument. It may have been created specifically to encumber this property at Fowler's instigation." Ethan sat down on the service bay bench. "How long have you known this?" he said. His voice was level. He kept it level deliberately. "I reviewed the files after the bar complaint came in." A pause. "I'm not going to tell you I would have found this otherwise. I might not have. Fowler's personal client matters weren't routinely visible to me." The weight underneath the precise voice was heavier now. "I'm telling you what I know when I know it. That's the best I can offer." "Send the documentation to James Whitfield," Ethan said. "His contact information is public record." "I already sent it this morning," Arthur Meade said. "I'm calling you as a courtesy, so you know what's coming before it arrives." He hung up. Ethan sat in the service bay for a moment. Tommy Reyes was at the other bench, working on a carburetor, and he'd heard enough of the conversation to know something significant had happened. He looked at Ethan and then looked back at his work with the discretion of a kid who understood when to give someone space. Ethan called James Whitfield. James had received the documentation 40 minutes before Ethan called. He'd already read it. His voice when he answered had a quality Ethan hadn't heard in it before, not excitement, because James Whitfield was not an excitable man, but the particular contained energy of a man looking at something that changes the shape of a problem he's been working on for weeks. If this documentation is authentic, James said, and Ethan could hear the restraint in how carefully he said if the lien was not an independent financial instrument. It was constructed. Fowler had a relationship with Southwest Capital that predated the lien filing, and there are communications suggesting he directed the creation of the lien specifically to encumber this property against future transfer. Which means, Ethan said, which means the entire basis of his challenge was manufactured. A manufactured lien cannot support a title challenge. The case collapses not on procedural grounds, but on the merits of the central instrument. James paused. It also means the bar complaint becomes significantly more serious. Suborning the creation of a fraudulent financial instrument to support litigation is not a technical violation. It's the kind of thing that ends careers. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How long? To get in front of Judge Reyes with this, I can file a motion to dismiss within 48 hours. The documentation from Meade is self-authenticating, its original firm records with the firm's metadata intact. Fowler can challenge its admissibility, but the challenge will be thin. James's voice was precise. I think it's over, Ethan. Not immediately. These things take time to process formally, but I think it's over. Ethan hung up. He told Tommy to hold down the bay for an hour. He got on his bike and he rode. Not anywhere specific. He rode the way he'd always ridden when he needed to think, not to clear his head, but to organize it, to let the motion and the road and the cold air do the work that stillness couldn't. He rode south out of Pueblo toward the plain, where the land opened up and the sky got big and the mountains sat to the west like something permanent and indifferent to whatever was happening at their feet. He rode for 40 minutes. He thought about Virgil Hayes. He thought about a man who had watched him for 9 years, who had engineered the conditions for him to find a building he had no reason to enter, who had left a system inside that building sophisticated enough to defeat a fraudulent legal challenge 11 years after he'd closed the doors. He thought about what it meant to build something that carefully, with that much patience, with that degree of faith in the unknown person who would eventually walk through the door. He thought about trust, the pattern, not the story. He thought about what his own pattern looked like viewed from outside by a man who was paying attention. He thought about the parking lot in Albuquerque and the drift north and the 9x12 room and the morning he raised his hand at a county auction for no reason that made rational sense and every reason that had eventually made every other kind of sense. He turned the bike around. He rode back to Old Thatcher Avenue. The formal dismissal of Fowler's challenge came 43 days later. Judge Patricia Reyes ruled from the bench in a proceeding that lasted 11 minutes. Fowler was not present. His attorney, a different lawyer, appeared in his place, which told its own story about how things had changed since the Monday morning. A process server had knocked on Ethan's door with 31 pages in the confidence of someone who expected to win. The documentation from Arthur Meade had done what James said it would do. The lien was ruled fatally defective not on the original procedural grounds, but on the more fundamental ground that there was credible evidence it had been manufactured to cloud title rather than representing a legitimate financial instrument. The challenge built on that lien had no foundation to stand on once the foundation was gone. The bar complaint against Fowler was proceeding separately and would take months to resolve. But James reported with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has spent his career believing the system should work and periodically seeing it do so, that the preliminary findings were serious, and that Fowler's ability to practice law in Colorado was likely to be significantly affected. Ethan received the news by phone standing at the service counter while Tommy was in the bay finishing a valve adjustment on a road glide, and a woman named Donna Prieto waited in one of the 2 chairs he'd set up near the front window for customers who preferred to wait. Donna was 81 years old, drove a Sportster she'd bought at 65, and had been coming to this building since Virgil Hayes had been alive to open it. She'd walked in 3 weeks earlier, looked around the front room, and said without preamble that it smelled right again. He'd looked at her. It smelled like Virgil's shop, she said. Oil and work and coffee. She'd looked at him with a direct assessment of a woman who had lived long enough to dispense with social softening. You're keeping it right. He'd thought about the knucklehead and what Virgil's father had said, keep this right. He'd thought that maybe right wasn't just a mechanical condition. Maybe it was a quality that spaces could hold something that lived in the patterns of use, and care and intention, rather than in the physical structure itself. Now he hung up the phone and stood at the counter. "Good news?" Donna asked from her chair. "The lawsuit is finished," he said. She nodded, unsurprised. "I figured it would be." She said it the way people who have lived a long time sometimes say things, not as optimism, but as the calm conclusion of someone who has watched enough situations resolve to have a sense of how they tend to go. Virgil didn't build things that fell apart easy. Ethan looked at her. "You knew him well." "Well enough." She adjusted the magazine in her lap without looking at it. "He fixed my bike for 20 years. Every time I came in, we talked. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers, which is rarer than it sounds." She paused. "He once told me something I've thought about a lot since he died." She looked up. "He said most people try to make their mark by being visible. The older I get, the more I think the real work is invisible. He said that's what makes it last." Ethan was quiet. "He was right," Donna said. "Oing." She picked up the magazine. "He usually was." Tud. The knucklehead was finished on the first Saturday of December. Ed Garza brought the chrome back on a Thursday, restored to a condition that Ethan hadn't thought achievable when he'd sent the parts out, a condition that made him understand something about what professional skill looked like when applied without compromise. The leather had been sourced through a craftsman in New Mexico who made period-correct pieces for vintage restoration, and when Ethan installed it, the bike became, for the first time since he'd found it, something complete. He'd worked on it for 6 weeks in the hours between jobs with a consistency he hadn't brought to anything in years. Not because he decided to be consistent, because the machine required it, and the requirement felt right, felt like the appropriate relationship between a person and a thing that deserved care. Saturday morning, he rolled it to the front of the building. Tommy was there. He'd started coming in on Saturdays even though the shop was officially closed, doing small projects and maintenance, and learning from the materials Ethan had started assembling for him, the manuals, the diagnostic guides, the particular body of knowledge that a good mechanic carries. He stood beside the knucklehead and looked at it with the focused appreciation of someone who understood enough about the difficulty of what he was seeing to know it was significant. "That's real," Tommy said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "You going to sell it?" Ethan looked at the bike. He thought about Virgil's father bringing it to his son and saying, "Keep this right." He thought about what Virgil had done for 30 years with a piece of metal and leather and rubber that had never been ridden in his custody, that had been maintained and restored and held ready without ever going anywhere. "No," he said. Tommy nodded. He didn't ask the next question, which was, then what? He was learning that some answers came in their own time, and the value of a thing wasn't always in its use. Carol Dempsey called at 10 that morning. "I wanted to tell you something," she said without preamble. "About Virgil." A pause. Carol's pauses were always deliberate, the pauses of a woman who thought before speaking and didn't fill silence with performance. "He was sick when he closed the building. He didn't tell many people. I knew because I did his books, and there were medical expenses that told the story." Another pause. "He closed the building because he couldn't maintain it anymore, and he didn't want it to decline. He chose to seal it rather than let it deteriorate." She paused once more. "He died 2 years after he closed, in a hospital room in Colorado Springs with no family left. His estate was minimal. He'd spent most of what he had on the system and on keeping the building viable for whoever came." Ethan stood in the front room holding the phone, looking at the knucklehead through the service bay doorway. "He believed someone would come," Carol said. "He died believing it. He didn't know who and he didn't know when, but he'd made his preparations and he'd set the conditions and he—" She stopped. When she continued, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. "He told me the last time I saw him that he wasn't worried. He said the right person would find it. He said the building knows what it's for, and what it's for will call the right person in." She was quiet for a moment. "I always thought that was a little too poetic for a man as practical as Virgil." "And now," Ethan said, "and now you're there," she said simply. He thanked her and hung up. He stood for a long moment. Then he went and got his jacket and his helmet, and he came back to the knucklehead. Tommy looked up from the workbench. "Lock up when you're done," Ethan said. Tommy looked at the knucklehead, at Ethan's helmet, at the front door. "Yeah," he said, "go ahead." Ethan wheeled the knucklehead to the door. He lifted it off the center stand. He walked it through the front entry and out onto the front lot of Old Thatcher Avenue, into the December air sharp and clear, the mountains west of Pueblo holding their permanent, indifferent position against the sky. He checked the fuel. He checked the controls. He did the walk around the way he always did, hands on the machine, reading it one last time before trusting it with his life. Because that's what riding was, an act of trust that started with knowledge and ended with something beyond knowledge. He put his leg over. He sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a rider about to start an engine. He thought about 11 years of sealed silence. He thought about a rubber-banded key and a combination on a scrap of paper and a cassette tape labeled "For Whoever Comes Next," and a letter with one word on the envelope, and a steel box, and 5 ledgers, and a trust account, and 9 people in a courthouse, and a bar complaint, and a dismissed lawsuit, and a 5th ledger filling up page by page with new names and new decisions and new debts that would never be owed. He thought about a highway outside Walsenburg and a broken engine in 15 minutes, and a phrase he'd said without thinking, "This isn't that kind of thing." He thought about Virgil Hayes dying in a hospital room in Colorado Springs with no family left, believing that the right person would find it, that the building knew what it was for, that what it was for would call the right person in. He kicked the engine. The knucklehead caught on the first kick. It ran the way an engine runs when it has been built right and kept right and restored right. Not with drama, not with noise, but with the deep, settled authority of a thing that knows its own purpose and meets it without apology. It ran with the sound of 50 years of American engineering expressing itself through a machine that should have been a relic and was instead somehow more alive than anything on the road that morning. Ethan sat on it and felt it run. He thought about what Virgil had said on the tape, somewhere worth going to. He pulled out onto Old Thatcher Avenue. He rode north through Pueblo, through the working streets and the quiet neighborhoods and the intersections that held the ordinary life of a city that didn't ask many questions and didn't offer many answers. He rode past the courthouse where 9 people had stood on the steps in the fall air. He rode past the hardware store where he'd spent $41 on a screwdriver and felt the specific weight of a man spending the last of what he had. He rode past the county auction signs that had long since come down from the poles where Gerald Pritt had taped them. He rode out of the city and into the open country west of Pueblo, where the road climbed toward the mountains and the sky opened up, and everything that had been pressing on him from every direction for the past 3 months seemed to recede, not because it was gone, but because the moving put it in proper perspective behind him, where it belonged, part of the story that had built the present moment rather than the obstacle between him and it. He rode for an hour. He pulled over on a stretch of highway where the shoulder was wide and the view was unobstructed, and the mountains stood the way they always stood, without opinion about what happened at their feet, patient in the way that permanent things are patient. He sat on the knucklehead and looked at the mountains. He thought about the 5th ledger sitting on the counter at Hayes Moto. He thought about Tommy Reyes at the workbench on a Saturday morning, learning, building the foundation of something that would be his own. He thought about Carol's list and the people on it. 11 of them now, 22, because he'd been adding names, the circle widening the way circles widen when the center holds. He thought about Virgil Hayes at 23 or 30 or 40, making the first decision in the first ledger without knowing what it would become, making it because it was the right thing and because he had the capacity and because the person in front of him needed it, and those 3 conditions together were enough of a reason, were always enough of a reason. He thought about what it meant to continue something, not to own it, not to inherit it, to continue it, to take up the thread where someone else had set it down and keep it moving in the same direction with the same intention, not because you were told to, but because you understood what it was, and understanding what it was made the continuation feel less like a choice and more like a recognition. He thought about the Hells Angels. He thought about what that name had meant to him for 11 years and what losing it had meant in the 3 years of drift that had followed. He thought about what it had cost him and what it had stripped away and what had been underneath the stripping, the things that were there before the identity was constructed and were still there after the construction collapsed. He thought about what brotherhood meant when it was real. It meant I see you and I stay. It meant I stop on the highway when no one requires me to stop. It meant I build something that will still work after I'm gone. He sat on the knucklehead for a long time. Then he kicked the bike into gear. He turned back toward Pueblo. He rode down out of the mountains and back into the city, back through the working streets, Back to Old Thatcher Avenue, back to the building with the Harley Davidson sign that had lost half its letters and still stood. He pulled into the front lot and shut the engine down and sat for a moment in the silence after. Tommy had locked up. The building was closed, but the light inside was still on the particular quality of light from the fluorescence in the service bay, coming through the gap under the back door, the light of a working space that had not gone dark. He had not turned that light off when he left. He would not turn it off tonight. He took off his helmet and held it in his hands and looked at the building, at the sign, at the boards that were gone from the windows, now at the clean glass, and the things visible through it, the service counter, the display cases with the first two new pieces of merchandise. He'd managed to source the photograph of Virgil on the wall behind the counter, where he'd put it 3 weeks ago, not as a shrine, but as a reminder, as a daily instruction to himself about the quality of attention required. The Harley sign still had letters missing. He hadn't fixed it. He thought he'd leave it that way. It had stood like that for 12 years. It would stand like that a while longer. People who needed to find this building would find it through word of mouth, through Danny Voss and Walt Pritchard, and the slow accumulation of reputation that comes from work done right, and people helped and nobody taking credit. The sign didn't need to be complete to mark the place. The place marked itself. He put the key in his pocket. He stood there in the December air with the mountains at his back and the city around him and the building in front of him, the building that had cost him $19 in 3 months of his life, and everything he thought he understood about what his life was for. Ethan Cole was a broke ex-Hells Angel who had bought an abandoned dealership for $19. He was also a man who had found what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life inside that $19 building in a locked steel box in 5 composition notebooks written in a dead man's block capitals in the specific gravity of a responsibility he hadn't asked for and would not set down. He was not running anymore. He was not drifting. He was not the man in the parking lot in Albuquerque with a tank bag and nowhere specific to point the bike. He was the man who kept the light on. And in Pueblo, Colorado, on a December morning with a knucklehead ticking cool behind him and a 5th ledger filling up inside, and 11 names becoming 22, becoming however many came next, that was exactly, precisely, and completely enough.